blood-soaked Navy SEAL crashed through the trauma bay doors at 11:47 p.m., and before any doctor could reach him, he grabbed the nearest arm, not the attending physician, not the charge nurse, but the quiet young woman standing in the corner, holding a clipboard, and rasped a single word against her ear. Hawk. Her face went completely still. 3 seconds passed. 5. The trauma team was already shouting vitals, calling for blood, and Claire Donovan, 26 years old, second-year nursing student, the woman that chief trauma surgeon doctor, Sandra Voss, had called barely adequate just that morning's, set down her clipboard, stepped forward, and said in a voice nobody in that room had ever heard from her before, "Get me 2 units O negative and move." Before this story goes any further, if you're watching this and you haven't subscribed yet, do it right now. Hit that button. Because what this woman did next inside that trauma bay is the kind of that changes how a hospital runs forever. And you do not want to miss the parts that come after this. Tap like if you're already hooked and drop your city or country in the comments. I want to see exactly how far this story has traveled. Now let's go back to that night. The first thing most people noticed about Claire Donovan was that she was easy to overlook. She was not the kind of person who filled a room. Medium height, lean build, dark hair. She kept pulled back so tightly it looked almost severe. She wore her scrubs the same way every day. Plain navy blue, no accessories, sleeves always down to the wrist, regardless of the temperature. Spoke when she was spoken to. She asked precise questions. She took careful notes and never once argued with an attending physician out loud, even when she knew they were wrong. At Harlow Regional Medical Center in Dunmore, Colorado, that kind of restraint was either a virtue or a warning sign, depending on who you asked. Dr. Sandra Voss, the chief of trauma surgery, had made up her mind about Claire Donovan within the first week of the fall rotation. "She's hesitant," Voss had told the residency coordinator. "Technically, she follows the steps, but there's no instinct there. No drive. She's going to struggle in a real trauma environment." She had paused, then added, "Keep her on observation. Don't put her primary on anything critical." That assessment had followed Claire like a shadow for 4 months. She was assigned to observe, to document, to stand back. When the trauma bays filled with car accident victims or post-surgical complications, Claire stood near the wall with her clipboard. And while residents who had been practicing half as long as she'd been studying handled cases she could have managed in her sleep. She never said that out loud. She filed it away behind careful, neutral eyes and kept doing exactly what she was told. What Sandra Voss did not know, what almost nobody at Harlow Regional knew, was that Claire Donovan had spent 3 years embedded with a Special Operations Reconnaissance Unit as a forward combat medic. She had treated gunshot wounds in active firefights, managed traumatic amputations with whatever was available in a field kit, run triage on mass casualty events in places that did not appear on most maps. She had kept men alive under conditions that would have broken most people physically and psychologically. Her unit had called her Hawk, not because she flew, because she saw things before anyone else, did a change in a patient's color, a shift in breathing pattern, a wound that looked stable but wasn't. She had a way of watching a situation and reading it 3 moves ahead that had become almost legendary among the operators she worked with. She had left the military 18 months ago, quietly and with very little explanation after an event in the Karadag corridor that she did not discuss with anyone. Not her friends, not the VA counselor she'd seen twice before stopping, not the nursing school faculty, who had accepted her application on the strength of her training records and a single paragraph recommendation from a senior enlisted officer who had described her in 1 sentence, "This medic kept my team alive when nothing else could." At Harlow Regional, none of that existed. She was a student, she observed. She stood near the wall until the night the helicopters came. It had been a slow evening, slow by trauma standards, which meant the waiting room was only half full and nobody had coded in the last 3 hours. Claire was 40 minutes into a 6-hour observation shift, standing near the supply cabinet in Trauma 2, while Dr. Voss and Dr. Pete Hadley, the senior trauma resident, processed a suspected internal bleed from a motorcycle accident. She was watching Hadley's hands and thinking quietly that he was about to miss something in the ultrasound read when the radio at the nurse's station crackled to life. Multiple inbound casualties. Military helicopter. Priority transport. ETA 11 minutes. The charge nurse, a compact, efficient woman named Darlene Cho, looked up from the desk. How many? 3 confirmed. 1 critical. Voss was already stripping her gloves. Hadley, finish here. I want 2 bays prepped and full resus carts. Who's on blood bank tonight? Ferreira. Call him now. I want ONEG available before they land. The next 11 minutes moved at that particular speed that trauma units develop, not frantic, exactly, but dense, with focused movement. Every person knowing their function and executing it without discussion. Claire moved with the rest of them, restocking the crash cart, checking airway equipment, doing exactly what she was assigned to do, and nothing more. She did not say anything about the helicopters. She did not say anything about the fact that her pulse had gone flat and clinical the moment she heard the call, the way it used to before a fire mission. Before a breach, before the kind of situations where emotional noise was a liability. She just worked. The helicopters came down on the roof pad at 11:44 p.m. 3 minutes later, the elevator doors opened and the world changed. 2 operators came through first on their own feet, one supporting the other, both of them in civilian clothes that were soaked through with blood that wasn't entirely theirs. Behind them came a gurney-moving fast paramedic team, bilateral leg compressions, manual airway hold, a blood pressure cuff already alarming. In the red, and behind the gurney came a man who was bleeding from a gash along his left forearm and walking anyway, scanning the room with the kind of eyes that are always counting exits. Tall, dark complexion. A stillness about him that looked like control and probably was. His gaze moved across the trauma bay in a single sweep. Nurses, residents, equipment carts, supply cabinets, and stopped. He was looking at Claire. She felt it before she registered it. That specific quality of being recognized by someone who knows exactly who you are. She had not seen Marcus Webb in 14 months. He crossed the room in 8 seconds, and she did not move away because there was no time and no point. And when he got close enough, he said it quietly, not dramatically, almost like he was reading an item off a list. Hawk, her clipboard was still in her hands. She looked at the man on the gurney massive frame, unconscious. Left leg bandaged but bleeding through, pallor already setting in, and something in her brain shifted register, the way a radio scanner locks onto a frequency and everything else goes to static. What happened? She said. Not a question. An intake. IED fragment. We controlled the bleed at the scene, but it's been compromised. Tourniquet slipped during transport. He's been down about 40 minutes. She was already moving toward the gurney. Femoral? Proximate. We don't know if it nicked the artery. She reached the gurney and put her hands on the bandaging, without asking anyone's permission. She peeled back the top layer and looked at what was underneath, and her face did not change, but dropped to the flat, precise register she had not used since the Karadag corridor. He's arterial. This isn't venous. She looked at the paramedic. Did you have a tourniquet above this the whole time? It was displaced. Is it arterial? Voss's voice came from her right, sharp, the tone she used when she thought someone junior was overstepping. Claire looked up. Yes. You're not qualified to make that assessment. Voss moved in, shouldered past, looked at the wound. 2 seconds of silence. Then, get me a vascular consult, and I want 2 large bore IVs. He needs volume. He needs the tourniquet repositioned first, Claire said. He's losing more than volume can replace. Step back. Dr. Voss, I said, step back. Donovan, you're an observer. She said the last word with a particular precision, the kind meant to remind someone of their place. Hadley, get in here. Claire stepped back. She stood at the edge of the béchy and watched Voss direct Hadley to establish IV access while the patient's blood pressure continued to drop. She watched the monitor. She watched the man on the gurney. She watched Webb, standing at the perimeter of the controlled chaos, watching her watch them, and she could see on his face the particular expression of a person who is deciding how long to wait before he stops being patient. The answer, as it turned out, was about 45 seconds. Because at 45 seconds, the monitor alarmed differently, not the rhythmic warning of a low blood pressure, but the sudden, flat shriek of a pressure that had dropped below the threshold where alarms stop being informative and start being retrospective. Claire was already moving. She was at the bedside before Hadley had finished processing what the monitor was telling him. And she had her hands on the wound before Voss turned around. And what she did next was not something she had learned in a nursing program classroom. It was something she had learned in a concrete building, in a country whose name she had never told anyone at Harlow Regional, holding a man's artery together with her bare hands while someone else handled incoming. She did not use a tourniquet. There was no time, and the placement options were limited by the wound location. Instead, she applied direct manual compression to the specific anatomical point she needed, her fingers finding the right position with a muscle memory precision that looked, to everyone watching, like something other than what a nursing student was supposed to be capable of. I need a clamp, she said. Nobody moved. A vascular clamp. 18 centimeter. Someone hand it to me right now. Darlene Cho was the one who moved. She had been a trauma nurse for 19 years, and she recognized what she was looking at, even if she couldn't immediately explain it. She opened the correct tray and put the clamp in Claire's hand without a word. Claire applied it. The bleeding slowed. The monitor changed its tone. The room was quiet for about 3 seconds. Then Voss said, "Who authorized you to touch this patient?" It was not a question. Claire did not look up. She was watching the clamp placement, checking the distal pulse, running through her assessment the way she had been trained to run it quickly in a specific order without editorializing. "Nobody," she said. "I touched him because he was going to die. You're a student. You don't have authority to..." "She just saved your patient." Webb's voice came from across the room, quiet and completely flat. He had not raised it. He did not need to. There was a quality to the way he spoke that made people stop what they were doing. "And if I were you, I would have your vascular surgeon in here right now, because that clamp needs to be converted to a proper repair, and the clock is running." Voss turned toward him. "Who are you?" "Master Chief Marcus Webb, Naval Special Warfare Development Group." He did not say it with any particular inflection. He just said it the way you state a fact. "And the woman you just told to step back has kept more of my people alive than any physician in this building. So I'd recommend getting out of her way." The room shifted. Not dramatically, no gasps, no sudden theatrical reversal. It was subtler than that. It was the particular shift that happens in high-stakes environments when authority is redistributed and everyone recalibrates. Darlene Cho had already recalibrated. 2 of the junior nurses exchanged a look. Hadley went very still. Voss's jaw tightened. "This is my trauma bay." "Then run it." Webb crossed his arms. "But run it with your vascular team and let her tell them what she found." The vascular surgeon, Dr. Anita Rao, arrived at a controlled jog 3 minutes later and took in the situation in a single assessment that stopped her mid-stride. She looked at the clamp. She looked at Claire's hands. She looked at the monitor, which was now showing numbers that were bad but stable, rather than numbers that were catastrophic. "Talk to me," Rao said, and she said it to Claire. And Claire did. She laid out the injury, the anatomical placement, the estimated blood loss, the interventions she'd used, and why, in the precise and jargonless language of someone who had done this before, not in simulation, not in a textbook scenario, but in the actual dark, with actual stakes. Rao listened without interrupting. When Claire finished, Rao nodded once and said, "Or 3 is open. Let's move." The gurney rolled. The team moved with it. Claire stepped back to let the surgical team take position, and Voss watched her do it, and the expression on Voss's face was not gratitude. It was something harder and more complicated than that, the expression of a person whose authority has just been publicly complicated and who has not yet decided what to do about it. The man on the gurney was named Jonas Pryor, and he was 31 years old, and he survived. Claire didn't find that out until 2 hours later, when she was sitting in the break room at the end of her shift with a cup of cold coffee she hadn't touched, and Darlene Cho came through the door and said, "He's in recovery." "Vitals are stable," Claire nodded. Darlene pulled out the chair across from her and sat down, which was not something the charge nurse typically did with nursing students. She studied Claire for a moment with the appraising look of someone who is revising a prior assessment. "Hawk," Darlene said. Claire looked up. "That's what he called you." "That man." "Webb. It's an old nickname." "From where?" Claire looked at her coffee cup. A different job. Darlene did not push. She was a woman who understood the particular weight of things people didn't say, and she let the silence do its work. After a moment, she said, "Voss is going to try to file something. I want you to know that before it happens." Claire looked up again. "She's going to say you acted outside your scope, that you created liability. She's already talked to the residency coordinator." Darlene's voice was even not unkind. "I'm telling you because you should hear it before it's official." Claire said nothing for a moment. Outside in the corridor, the sound of wheels on linoleum, a PA announcement, someone laughing at a nurse's station somewhere down the hall. The ordinary background noise of a hospital that had just nearly lost a patient, and then hadn't. "What would you have done?" Claire said. "If you'd been the one standing there." Darlene didn't hesitate. "Same thing you did." "Okay." Claire nodded slowly. "Then I'm not going to apologize for it." Darlene stood. She didn't say anything else, but at the door she paused and looked back, and there was something in her expression that was close to respect, but not quite, that something older and more specific. The look of one person who has kept things alive in hard conditions, recognizing that quality in another. Then she was gone, and Claire was alone in the break room with her cold coffee and the quiet knowledge that tomorrow was going to be worse. She was right. The next morning, Sandra Voss called her into the office on the administrative side of the surgical wing at 7:15 a.m., which was 15 minutes before Claire's shift was scheduled to start. Timing was not accidental. The office was neat in a way that communicated authority-framed credentials, a desk without visible clutter, 2 chairs positioned slightly too far apart for comfortable conversation. Voss was behind the desk when Claire came in, and she didn't gesture to the chairs. She just started talking. "I've reviewed the incident from last night," Voss said. "I want to be clear about what I observed. You overrode a direct instruction from the attending physician. You performed a procedure without authorization. You placed a critically injured patient at elevated risk by executing an intervention you are not credentialed to perform." Claire stood in the doorway and said nothing. "The nursing program's scope of practice is clear. You are a student. You observe. You assist. You do not diagnose. You do not intervene independently, and you do not override the judgment of licensed physicians." Voss's voice was level and formal, the voice of someone who had rehearsed this. "I'm recommending that you be removed from the trauma rotation, effective immediately. You'll complete the semester in a non-critical capacity pending a full review of your conduct." "He would have died," Claire said. Voss looked at her without expression. "That is not a determination you were qualified to make. The blood pressure tells you that. You don't need credentials to read a monitor. The blood pressure tells me the patient was deteriorating. It does not tell a nursing student that the appropriate response is to take a vascular clamp to a critically injured man." Voss leaned forward slightly. I understand that you believe you did the right thing. I'm telling you that your belief is not the same as authorization. And in a medical environment, the distinction matters. Claire looked at her for a long moment. She thought about Corporal Ben Rauchio, 19 years old, Karadag Corridor, the night she had made a decision, in under 4 seconds, that the Army had later reviewed for 3 months and ultimately called correct. She thought about the 6 men who had come home. Because she had made calls she wasn't technically authorized to make in situations where the authorized person was not available, and the clock did not care about authorization. She thought about Jonas Pryor, who was in recovery right now with stable vitals. Okay, Claire said. Voss blinked. She had expected argument. Okay, I heard you. Claire did not move from the doorway. Are you done? Something flickered in Voss's expression, not quite uncertainty, but close. She straightened. You can collect your personal items after your shift today. Report to the medical surgical floor supervisor by Monday. Understood. Claire left. She walked down the corridor toward the trauma wing, moving at the same unhurried pace she always moved at, and she did not stop when she passed the door to Trauma 1, and she did not look at Voss's office as she passed the administrative hallway on the way to the locker room. She collected her bag. She changed out of her scrubs. She was 14 steps from the exit when a voice she recognized stopped her. Hawk. Webb was leaning against the corridor wall outside the consultation room, still in the same clothes from last night, a cup of coffee in his hand that was not from the hospital cafeteria. His 2 teammates, the ones who'd come through on their own feet, were visible through the consultation room window. One of them asleep in a chair, the other on the phone. How is he? Claire said. Pryor's stable. Rao says he'll need rehab, but he's functional. Webb looked at her. You're leaving. Shift doesn't start for another 2 hours. I mean, you're leaving the program. Claire stopped. How do you know that? Because I've been here all night, and these buildings have thin walls. He studied her with those quiet, assessing eyes. He had always been able to read her, not because she was easy to read, but because he had learned specifically how she hid things. What did she say? That I acted outside my scope. You saved his life. That's not how it's being framed. Webb was quiet for a moment. He turned the coffee cup in his hand, a gesture she remembered from a dozen different briefings, in a dozen different places. Webb thinking, working through something, deciding whether to say it. You know what Pryor told me this morning, first thing when he was conscious enough to talk? He didn't wait for her to answer. He said he remembered a voice. In the trauma bay, when everything was going to static. He said someone's voice cut through it. Calm, specific, telling people exactly what to do. He paused. He thought it was the surgeon. Claire said nothing. I told him it wasn't. The corridor was quiet around them. Somewhere overhead, a PA system crackled and announced something routine. The ordinary machinery of a hospital, going about its ordinary business. They're going to file a formal complaint, Claire said. Kind that follows you. If I fight it, it turns into a thing. If I just take the reassignment and finish the semester somewhere quiet, it goes away. And if you take the reassignment, what happens the next time there's a Jonas Pryor in that trauma bay, and you're in a different wing doing vitals checks? Claire didn't answer. Webb looked at her. I'm not here to tell you what to do. You know that. I've never told you what to do. He paused. But I've got a folder on my secure drive that has your service record, your commendations, your combat medic certifications, and the operational report from Karadag, where the review board specifically noted your actions as exemplary. He took a sip of his coffee. I brought it because I knew we were coming to a civilian facility, and I wanted to know what kind of situation we were walking into. But it's there. Claire looked at him for a long moment. That's not your fight, she said. No, he agreed. But it might be yours. She picked up her bag. She thought about a lot of things in the space of that silence, Ben Rauchio, who she still thought about at 3A. M, in the specific way that never fully resolves. The 6 men who came home. Jonas Pryor in a recovery room 2 floors above them with stable vitals and a repaired artery and no idea that the person who had put a clamp in exactly the right place was currently being asked to go push a medication cart in a non-critical ward. She thought about Sandra Voss saying, "You're a student," and meaning it as the end of a sentence when it should have been the start of a question. She set her bag back down. "Where's the folder?" she said. Webb reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and produced a sealed military records envelope, the kind with a chain of custody form along the bottom edge, and held it out. Claire took it. She stood in that corridor with a sealed envelope in her hands, and the knowledge that what she was about to do was not going to be clean or simple or resolved in a way that left no residue, and she thought, good. Real things usually aren't. But across the floor, in a recovery room, Jonas Pryor's heart monitor beeped in the steady, even rhythm of a man who was still alive because someone had made a call that wasn't in any protocol manual. And down the hall, in a neat administrative office, Sandra Voss was already writing the formal language of a complaint that was designed to permanently erase the woman who had made it. And in the trauma bay, where all of it had happened, Darlene Cho was prepping for the morning shift with the careful efficiency of someone who had been watching this Hoppeltepten Mim understanding for 19 years and had spent last night revising her understanding of what happened in it, and who had, before she started her shift, made a phone call to the nursing program's academic standards board that Voss did not know about yet. The morning was just beginning, and woman nobody had bothered to see was no longer interested in being overlooked. The morning was just beginning, and the woman nobody had bothered to see was no longer interested in being overlooked. She went back to the locker room first. Not because she needed anything from it. Her bag was already packed, had been packed since before Voss called her in, some part of her having anticipated the shape of the morning even before it took that shape. She went back because she needed 60 seconds in a room where nobody was watching her, and the locker room at 7:30 a.m. was empty, and 60 seconds was enough. She sat on the bench. She held the envelope in both hands. She looked at her own name, typed on the front in the flat sans serif font of official military records, and thought about what it meant to open it, not the literal contents which she knew by memory, but the act. The decision to stop being the person who sat in the corner with a clipboard and started being the person who had earned that call sign in the first place. Ben Rauchio was still dead. That part didn't change. Envelope didn't change it, and neither did Jonas Pryor's stable vitals 2 floors up. She had learned the hard way that surviving something and resolving something were not the same category of event, and she was clear-eyed enough about her own psychology to know that she had spent the last 18 months confusing the two. She put the envelope in her bag. Then she stood up, shouldered the bag, and walked back out into the corridor, because 60 seconds was enough, and the morning was not going to wait. Webb was still in the hallway when she came back through. He had finished his coffee and was now simply standing, with his arms crossed, watching the foot traffic move past him, the way operators always watched rooms. Not obviously. Not with the performative alertness of someone trying to look tactical, but with the settled habitual attention of a person for whom environmental awareness was as automatic as breathing. He looked at her bag, then at her face. He didn't ask. "I'm going to need a few hours," Claire said. "We're not going anywhere. Pryor can't be moved for at least 48. Okay." She paused. "Webb. The formal complaint Voss files, it goes to the nursing program director and the hospital's academic review board. If your documentation contradicts her assessment of my competency, it creates a conflict of record. The board has to investigate. I know. That investigation is going to be uncomfortable. For the hospital. For her." She looked at him steadily. "And it might not go the way we want it to go." "Hawk," Webb said. "I've been in uncomfortable situations before. I know you have. I'm telling you anyway." He nodded once, and that was the end of that. It was the thing she had always appreciated about him. He received information without performing a reaction to it, which was rarer than it sounded and more useful. She left. The nursing program director at Harlow Regional's affiliated school was a man named Dr. Gregory Falk, and his office was not in the hospital, but in the academic building 3 blocks east, a slightly tired brick structure that smelled like old coffee and photocopier toner, and the accumulated weight of institutional decisions. Claire had been to his office twice before. Once during orientation. Once, after a practical exam, she'd finished 12 minutes ahead of the posted time limit, which had prompted an inquiry into whether she had actually completed all the required steps. She had. She had completed them faster than the rubric anticipated. Falk's assistant told her he was in a meeting. Claire said she would wait. She sat in the plastic chair outside his office and took out a paperback she kept in her bag for exactly this kind of waiting and read 15 pages without absorbing any of them, which was fine because the point was not the book. Falk emerged at 8:40 a.m., saw Claire, and did the small visible recalibration that people did when they encountered her in a context they hadn't expected. "Ms. Donovan, I was going to call you this morning." "I know," Claire said. "That's why I came in person." He held the door open. She went inside. His office was the opposite of Voss's, cluttered, warm, stacks of papers that suggested genuine use rather than managed appearance, a plant that needed watering on the windowsill. He was a man in his late 50s who had the look of someone who had been idealistic once and still had access to that version of himself on good days. Claire had assessed him as basically decent during orientation and had not revised that assessment since. Put the envelope on his desk before he could start speaking. He looked at it. "What is this?" "My service record. My combat medic certifications, my commendations, and an operational review from my last field assignment that specifically addresses my competency in trauma intervention." She sat down. "Dr. Voss is filing a formal complaint today that characterizes last night's intervention as reckless and outside my scope. I'm here to provide context." Falk opened the envelope with the careful, slightly reluctant energy of a man who understands that what he is looking at is going to require him to do something uncomfortable. He scanned the top page. His expression changed in small increments, not dramatically, just the steady micro-adjustments of someone processing information that doesn't fit the folder they already had open for this person. "You were a combat medic," he said. 3 years. Special operations support. This says. He stopped reading and looked up at her. "Why didn't you disclose this during your application?" "I did. It's in my application materials. The practicum supervisor told me it was noted but not relevant to my current student status, and that my training would be assessed fresh without prior assumptions." Falk was quiet for a moment. He turned a page, turned another. His face had settled into a look that was not comfortable. "Last night," Claire said, "I intervened because the patient was going to die in approximately 90 seconds if nobody repositioned the hemorrhage control and applied direct compression to the arterial bleed. Dr. Voss had ordered everyone to establish IV access, which is the right call for most presentations, but not for an uncontrolled arterial hemorrhage with that degree of blood loss. I applied a vascular clamp and controlled the bleed long enough for the surgical team to take over. Pryor's in recovery with stable vitals this morning. I understand that the patient survived. The patient survived because someone made a specific decision in a specific moment. That's the part that's going to get lost in the formal language of the complaint." Falk set the papers down. He looked at her in the way that people look at someone they are realizing they have seriously underestimated, which is a specific look, not quite apologetic, not quite impressed. Somewhere in the uncomfortable territory between the two where accountability lives. "The complaint hasn't been filed yet," he said. "As of this morning. It will be. Probably before noon." Claire met his eyes. "I'm not asking you to block it. I'm asking you to read what's in that envelope before you make a determination." He nodded slowly. That's a reasonable ask. One more thing. She reached into her bag and produced a second document, a single printed page with a case number and a timestamp at the top. This is the intake form from last night. I filled it out after my shift. It includes my clinical observations, the timeline, and the specific assessment that led to my decision to intervene. She put it on top of the envelope. For the record, Falk looked at the page. He looked at Claire. He had the expression of a man who had gone into this meeting expecting to deliver a difficult conversation and was now sitting in a different conversation than the one he had prepared for. I'll read it this morning, he said. Thank you. She stood. He stayed seated, which she noticed, because he had stood when she came in, and the shift in body language was the kind of small tell that usually meant something. At the door, she paused. Dr. Falk, I'm not asking for special treatment because of what I've done before. I'm asking to be treated the same way you'd treat any practitioner whose documented competency directly contradicts the characterization in a disciplinary complaint. She paused. That's all. She left him there with the envelope and the intake form, and whatever he did with them was going to be what it was going to be. Spent the next 2 hours doing something that looked, from the outside, like nothing. She sat in the hospital cafeteria with a breakfast she didn't particularly want and worked through what she knew and what she didn't know and what the likely sequence of events was going to be over the next 48 hours. It was the same process she had used before operations, not obsessive, not anxious, just the deliberate mapping of terrain so that when the moment came she wasn't navigating blind. What she knew Voss was going to file. The complaint would cite unauthorized intervention, scope violation, potential patient endangerment. It would be thorough because Voss was thorough. It would cite specific regulations and use the language of liability because Voss was a physician who understood that institutions respond to liability language faster than they respond to anything else. What she didn't know, whether Falk had the standing or the willingness to complicate the process before it went forward, whether the Academic Review Board had any mechanism for weighting external competency evidence against scope of practice violations, whether the hospital's risk management office would get involved, and if so, which direction they'd push. What she was fairly sure of that Darlene Cho had made a phone call this morning that was going to introduce at least one new variable into the situation, though she didn't know what form that variable would take. She ate her breakfast. She drank her coffee while it was still hot. She thought about Jonas Pryor's heart monitor and the specific sound it had made when it stopped alarming. And she allowed herself, just for a moment, to feel the thing that she usually kept filed away in a section of herself she didn't open in public. Then she closed that section and moved on. She was halfway back through the cafeteria when her phone buzzed. Unknown number with a Colorado area code she didn't recognize. She answered. Ms. Donovan. A woman's voice, professional, slightly clipped. My name is Renata Vidal. I'm the Patient Advocate Coordinator for Harlow Regional Surgical Division. I'd like to speak with you today if you're available. Claire stopped walking. About what, specifically? About the events of last night in the trauma bay, and about Mr. Pryor, a pause. I've received a request this morning from the patient to be informed about who was involved in his care. Pryor had asked. He'd woken up in recovery and asked who had been in that room. Claire stood in the middle of the cafeteria with a tray of dishes she'd forgotten. She was still carrying and recalibrated. Can be available, she said. When? This afternoon. 1 o'clock. I'll be there. She hung up and stood for another 3 seconds. And then she found the tray return station and put her dishes away and walked back toward the hospital proper because the terrain had just changed and she needed to update her map. What she didn't know, because she was in the cafeteria when it happened, was that at 9:15 Sandra Voss had walked into the office of Hospital Chief Administrator Daniel Pruitt and filed not just a formal complaint, but a preliminary recommendation for program dismissal, the kind that, once filed with the academic institution, created a timeline that forced the program to act within 15 days, regardless of pending investigation. Pruitt was a man who ran a hospital with the careful political navigation of someone perpetually aware of how many constituencies he was trying to keep satisfied simultaneously, and his first question to Voss had been, "Is the patient stable?" He is. And was there liability exposure from the student's intervention? There was unauthorized contact with a critical patient. That's not the question I asked. Pruitt's voice was patient in the way that powerful people's voices are patient with an awareness of time and leverage underneath it. Was there liability exposure? Voss had paused. The outcome was positive. But the process, I understand the process was irregular. I'm asking about exposure. The intervention used equipment and techniques outside a student's authorized scope. Voss's voice had stayed level, which cost her something, because what she wanted to do was make the case for why this mattered as a matter of principle, and she could feel the conversation sliding away from principle toward calculation. If we don't act, we're implicitly ratifying a student performing vascular procedures. Pruitt had been quiet for a moment. Let me look at the night's documentation. I'll have a response to you by end of day. It was not the decisive support Voss had walked in expecting, and she had left his office with the distinct unpleasant sensation of a situation that was not moving in the direction she had organized it to move. None of this had reached Claire, yet when she arrived at Renata Vidal's office at 1 o'clock. The patient advocate's office was on the 4th floor, which was administrative territory quieter than the clinical floors, with carpet instead of linoleum, and the kind of carefully neutral artwork that hospitals put on walls when they want the space to feel calm rather than medicalized. Vidal was a compact woman in her 40s with reading glasses she kept taking on and off, and a desk covered in the organized chaos of someone handling multiple cases simultaneously. "Thank you for coming," she said. She did not do the kind of preliminary small talk that would have made Claire more comfortable and might have softened what came next, which Claire appreciated. "Mr. Pryor has specifically requested information about who intervened in his care last night. As his advocate, my job is to gather that information and relay it according to his wishes." She looked at Claire over the glasses. "I've also been asked by Dr. Rao to speak with you independently. She has some concerns she wanted communicated." "What kind of concerns?" "Good kind." Vidal set down the glasses. "She wanted me to convey that in her assessment, the intervention you performed last night was correct. That the clamp placement was, and I'm quoting her directly, anatomically precise in a way that suggested significant practical experience. She's going to say so formally if the review process requires it." Something shifted in Claire's chest. Not relief, exactly too complicated for that. More like the specific weight of being seen clearly by someone who knows what they're looking at. She also said, Vidal continued, with the slight flattening of tone that meant she was now relaying something more complicated, that there are internal conversations happening at a level above the review process that she's not part of, and that you should be aware the situation is moving faster than formal channels usually move. Claire was quiet. "How fast?" "Fast enough that I'd suggest you consider having your own representation before the end of today." She hadn't considered that. She had been thinking in terms of documentation and evidence and institutional process, and she had not been thinking in terms of an adversarial proceeding that might require her to have someone in her corner who knew how this particular kind of fight worked. "Okay," Claire said. "Mr. Pryor would also like to see you," Vidal added. "When you're ready. He's been asking since this morning." She stopped at the nurse's station on the recovery floor to check with the charge nurse before going in, because that was the right process, and she was not going to stop following right process just because someone was trying to argue she didn't understand it. Charge nurse, a young man whose name tag said Kowalski, looked at her visitor badge and then at a note on his desk, and then back at her with an expression that suggested her visit had been anticipated. "He's been awake since 7, Kowalski said. "He's comfortable, but he's been asking." "Go ahead." The room was quiet and bright in the flat, functional way of recovery rooms, all the drama of the previous night compressed into the mechanical ordinariness of monitoring equipment and IV lines and the smell of antiseptic. Jonas Pryor was propped up at about 30 degrees, which was about as upright as a man with his injury profile. Should have been attempting this soon. And he had the look of someone who had decided not to let the physical situation take more authority over him than he was willing to give it. He was big, she hadn't fully registered, that in the chaos of the previous night, having been focused on the wound and the blood pressure and the precise placement of her hands. Broad across the shoulders, mid-30s, with the particular kind of face that has been outdoors in harsh conditions for a significant portion of its existence. Color was still off, anyone's would be, after that degree of blood loss, but his eyes were sharp and focused. He looked at her for a moment before he said anything. "But I remember your voice," he said, "from last night. You weren't fully conscious. I wasn't fully unconscious either." He shifted slightly, controlled the visible discomfort of that with a practiced neutrality. "Webb told me what happened after. How are you feeling?" "Like someone cut into my leg and repaired a blood vessel, which is exactly what happened. So," he paused, "I want to say thank you. I'm aware that's not an adequate response to what you did, but I don't have a better one. You don't need to thank me. I know I don't need to. I want to." He looked at her with an assessment that was frank and not particularly gentle. The way people look at each other when they've been through something together, and politeness has been rendered irrelevant. "Webb also told me about the situation with the surgeon. That's a hospital matter. It's also a matter of someone trying to hang you out for saving my life." His voice didn't change volume, but something in its quality shifted. "I've got a problem with that. Webb told me about the envelope. The records." He paused. "I've been on enough operational assessments to know what a combat medic's service record looks like when someone's actually done the job versus when they've filled a billet. What you have in that folder is the real thing. The kind of thing that shouldn't be sitting in a nursing student's corner being told to observe." Claire was quiet for a moment. "I chose to be here." "I know. That's not what I mean." He looked at her carefully. "I mean, someone in this hospital had access to information about your background and made a decision about what to do with it. And the decision they made doesn't add up." She went very still. It was the thing she hadn't let herself examine too directly yet, the nagging structural wrongness of it. Falk had said her background was noted in her application materials, which meant the practicum supervisor who'd placed her with Voss had known, which meant Voss's department had been informed, and Voss had placed her on observation duties and publicly characterized her as hesitant and without instinct 4 months into a rotation. Either Voss hadn't read the application notes possible if she'd delegated the intake process to a coordinator, or she had read them. "Webb's unit has a liaison office," Pryor said, "for situations involving personnel and civilian institutions. It's not standard, but it exists." He held her gaze. "He's already made a call." The corridor outside the room was ordinary and continuous footsteps, the squeak of wheels, a distant intercom. The sounds of a hospital processing its regular business, unaware that in one recovery room, a conversation was happening that was about to expand the scope of what was at stake considerably beyond a nursing student's practicum placement. Claire thought about Sandra Voss's neat office, the framed credentials, careful language of the complaint, the 4 months of being told to stand back, stand aside, observe. She thought about whether it had been dismissiveness, the ordinary, institutional kind, the kind that happens when authority assumes hierarchy and stops paying attention, or whether it had been something else, something deliberate, shaped by a specific knowledge that Voss had been given access to and had chosen to use in a particular way. She had no answer to that yet. But she thought about Darlene Cho's phone call this morning, about Renata Vidal's warning that things were moving faster than formal channels usually move, about Gregory Falk sitting with an envelope he hadn't expected and a decision he hadn't expected to have to make. She thought about the way Voss's jaw had tightened in the trauma bay when Webb had said, "Get out of her way." The kind of expression that is not surprised, Claire realized now, reconstructing the image. It was the expression of someone who is not surprised, but is very displeased, which was not the same thing. "What kind of call?" Claire said quietly. Pryor looked at her steadily. "The kind that documents a pattern." She absorbed that. A pattern. 3 other practitioners. Different civilian facilities. Different contexts. He let that settle. People with special operations backgrounds, who ended up in subordinate positions under Doctor. Sandra Voss's authority at various points in her career. All of them quietly sidelined. None of them formally investigated, just managed down and out. He paused. Webb started pulling the thread this morning. That's what he does. He pulls threads. The room was very quiet. Claire looked at the window, which showed a standard administrative view of a parking structure and a gray November sky, and thought about Sandra Voss telling her, "You're a student," with that specific precision, that deliberate weight, and whether it had been contempt or control, and which one was worse. She thought she knew the answer. "I need to make a phone call," she said. "Vidal's list has an attorney who does healthcare regulatory work," Pryor said. "She does pro bono for wrongful practitioner actions. Top of the list. I noticed because I asked." Claire looked at him. "I asked this morning," he said, without apology. "Before you got here." She was not accustomed to people doing things on her behalf without being asked. She was not entirely sure how to process it without making the moment awkward, and she settled for not trying, just nodding once with the direct acknowledgement of one person to another who has done something that matters. "Thank you," she said. "You did the surviving," he said, which was not quite a smile but was adjacent to one. "I'm just returning the favor." She stepped back from the bed. At the door, she paused, because something else had occurred to her, the thread that Pryor had just described, the pattern that Webb was pulling, the 3 other names that were now presumably in a file on a secure drive somewhere. "Webb started this morning," she said, 6 a.m. She thought about the fact that Webb had been in this building since before dawn, not recovering from a long night and waiting for his teammate to stabilize, but actively working. Pulling files, making calls, building something. He had done this before. She came home back down the corridor with the envelope in her hands. Before she had even made the decision, he had already decided what he was going to do. She walked out of the recovery room and down the corridor toward the elevator, and she pulled out her phone, and she found the name at the top of Renata Vidal's referral list, and she made the call. The attorney answered on the second ring. Her name was Petra Holt, and her voice had the quality of someone who had been doing difficult things in difficult rooms for a long time and had stopped being surprised by the shape they took. "Ms. Donovan," she said, "I've been expecting your call." Claire stopped walking. "How?" "Because someone called my office at 7 this morning and told me to expect it. A beat. Military. Senior enlisted. Wouldn't give a name." Claire stood in the corridor with her phone against her ear and the elevator doors opening in front of her and the sound of the hospital moving through its afternoon, and she thought about Marcus Webb standing in the hallway with a cup of coffee that wasn't from the cafeteria and eyes that were already counting moves ahead. "Ms. Donovan," Holt said, "are you there?" "I'm here. I've reviewed the preliminary information I was provided. I'd like to meet today, if possible. What I've been told suggests we're not dealing with a routine scope of practice dispute." Her voice was careful and precise. "What I've been told suggests that what happened to you last night may be the most visible incident in a pattern of conduct that goes back considerably further." A pause. "And that you may not be the only person it has happened to." The elevator doors slid closed in front of her. Down the hall, at the nurse's station, a monitor alarmed briefly and then settled. Someone laughed at a different station, the short, tired laugh of a long shift. The hospital breathed around her with its ordinary rhythms, processing its ordinary business, entirely unaware that in a recovery room 2 floors above, a man who had nearly died the night before had spent his morning pulling a thread, and that the thread, when pulled, had turned out to be attached to something much larger and much older than one bad night in a trauma bay. Sandra Voss's office was on the 4th floor of the surgical wing, and somewhere in the files that Webb had been accessing since 6A. There were 3 other names, and Petra Holt was waiting, and Claire Donovan, who had 4 months being told to stand back and observe, had stopped standing back. She pressed the elevator call button again. The doors opened. She stepped in. When they closed behind her, her reflection in the steel panel was calm, focused, and entirely recognizable to anyone who knew what they were looking at as the woman who had once kept an entire special operations unit alive in the dark. Her phone buzzed. Webb, 1 message. 4 words. Voss knew. Come up. She pressed the elevator call button again. The doors opened. She stepped in, and before they closed, she typed back a single word. Where? His response came in under 4 seconds. Conference room. Surgical admin. 3rd floor now. She changed floors. The surgical administrative corridor on the 3rd floor was a different register than the clinical spaces, quieter, more deliberate, with the particular hush of rooms where decisions about other people's careers got made. Webb was standing outside a door marked Conference B, and he was not alone. Beside him was a woman Claire didn't recognize, late 40s, dark blazer, a structured quality to the way she held herself that read either military or federal, and Claire's instinct said federal. Webb looked at Claire once when she stepped off the elevator, a quick, confirming look, then gestured to the door. Inside, he said. I'll explain in sequence. The room had a long table and 8 chairs and a whiteboard that someone had already written on. 3 columns. Names, dates, facilities. Claire recognized none of the names. She recognized 2 of the facility names as hospitals in different states. The woman in the blazer was already seated at the far end of the table. She had a laptop open and a badge on a lanyard that she had not tucked away, which meant she was comfortable with being identified. Defense Health Agency, Office of Inspector General. Claire sat down. Webb remained standing. He had the particular kind of energy she recognized from pre-operation briefings contained, dense, directed, and he went straight into it without preamble. Her name has come up before, he said. Voss. Not in a criminal context. Not in a formal complaint context. In a patterns context, the kind of low-level institutional friction that doesn't generate paperwork, because the people it happens to are the kind of people who are trained to absorb difficulty without making noise. He put his hand on the whiteboard. 3 practitioners over 9 years, 2 former military, 1 former federal law enforcement paramedic, all placed in subordinate positions under Voss's authority at different institutions, all characterized in evaluations as inadequately prepared, hesitant, scope inappropriate, all quietly managed out of clinical advancement tracks. He paused. None of them filed formal grievances. One of them stopped practicing altogether. The woman from the OIG spoke without introducing herself further, which Claire noted. My office has been monitoring a broader pattern of credential suppression in civilian medical institutions as it relates to practitioners with non-traditional training backgrounds. Dr. Voss's name appeared in that dataset 8 months ago. We flagged it but had no active incident to attach it to. She looked at Claire without any particular expression. Last night gave us an active incident. Claire looked at Webb. How did your liaison office get to the OIG in one morning? We didn't go to them. A pause. They were already watching. The weight of that settled in the room. Claire looked at the whiteboard again. 3 columns. She thought about being placed on observation duty in the first week of her rotation. She thought about the practicum supervisor who had told her that her background was noted but not relevant. She thought about Voss saying, "You're a student," with that particular precision. The 4 months of standing back. "You think she did it intentionally," Claire said. It was not quite a question. "I think the pattern is too consistent to be accidental," Webb said. 3 practitioners, 3 different institutions in her career history, all with the same profile, significant operational training, no traditional medical school pathway, and all sidelined within 6 months of rotation, under her authority. He crossed his arms. Whether it was a deliberate policy or a deep bias that produced consistent outcomes, I honestly can't tell you. Outcome is the same. The outcome matters more than the intent, the OIG agent said, from an investigative standpoint. "What does your office need?" Claire said. "Your cooperation in a formal statement. Documentation of the last 4 months. Your records from last night." The agent glanced at the laptop. "And access to the formal complaint Voss filed this morning, which we're in the process of obtaining through the hospital's regulatory reporting channel." She filed it at 9:47 a.m. It went to the nursing program director and the hospital's chief administrator simultaneously. Standard filing. A beat. Less standard was the secondary communication she sent to the Academic Review Board's external accreditation contact, which bypassed the internal investigative process entirely and created a timeline that would force a dismissal recommendation within 15 days. She said it neutrally, without editorial. Part is irregular. Claire was very still, bypassing internal investigation to force a timeline. It was not the action of someone who was confident in the strength of a legitimate complaint. It was the action of someone who needed the process to move faster than the evidence could be examined. "She knows the records exist," Claire said. "My service record. Commendations. She's known for 4 months," Webb said. The application notes were in the practicum placement file. "I confirmed that this morning." His voice was level, but there was something underneath it, not quite anger, which Webb rarely expressed directly, but the specific compressed quality of a man who is being careful about how much of what he is feeling goes into his words. "She read them before your first day." The room was quiet for a moment. "Where does the formal complaint go from here?" Claire said. The agent answered, "If the hospital's internal review moves forward before my office files a formal inquiry, the complaint gets processed under standard disciplinary protocol. Given the 15-day timeline Voss has created, that means an academic review board hearing within 2 weeks and a likely recommendation for program dismissal." She paused. "If my office files a formal inquiry first, it supersedes the internal process and places the complaint in a holding pattern pending federal review. How long does that take to file?" "Procedurally, 24 hours, from the time I document the active incident report, which I started this morning." She met Claire's eyes. "I'll have it filed by end of day tomorrow." 24 hours. Voss's timeline was 15 days, but the complaint was already in motion. Internal processes could accelerate. Pruitt had said he'd have a response by end of day, and depending on what he decided, that response might not wait for a federal inquiry to arrive. Claire looked at the whiteboard. The 3 names in the left column were other people's versions of standing in a corner with a clipboard, while their competency was managed down to nothing by a system that had decided what they were before it looked at what they could do. She thought about the one who had stopped practicing altogether. "I'll give you the statement," she said, "today, whatever you need." The agent nodded and opened a new file on her laptop. "I'd like to start in an hour, if that's workable." "It's workable. One more thing." The agent's voice did not change tone. "We're going to need you to continue your normal presence in the hospital for the next 24 hours. Don't withdraw from the rotation. Don't give the internal process reason to accelerate by treating the complaint as already decided." She looked at Claire steadily. "Voss will expect you to retreat. We need you not to." It was a precise and unglamorous ask, to walk back into the building where someone was actively trying to remove her and act as though the ground beneath her was stable for 24 hours, while invisible processes moved in parallel. She had done harder things in more uncomfortable places. Understood, she said. The statement took 90 minutes. Claire sat in Conference B and answered questions in the flat, detailed way she had learned to answer operational debriefs, specific, sequential, without editorializing, letting the facts carry whatever weight they were capable of carrying without her help. She described the 4 months of observation duty. She described the practicum supervisor's comment about her background being noted. She described each instance she could recall of Voss directly limiting her clinical involvement, despite her attempting to engage appropriately. She described the night of the helicopter arrivals in the kind of clinical detail that left very little room for interpretation. The agent recorded everything and asked follow-up questions that were precise and occasionally uncomfortable, the kind designed to expose weaknesses in the account. And Claire answered all of them without deflection, because her account did not have weaknesses. When it was over, the agent said, "This is solid, not as a compliment, just as an assessment. I'll have the inquiry filed before noon tomorrow." Claire left the conference room and stood in the corridor for a moment, because the adrenaline of the statement had metabolized, and underneath it was a particular kind of tired that she recognized as the fatigue of doing something that cost you something, even when it was the right thing to do. She went back to work, not to the trauma rotation. She had been formally removed from that pending review, and stepping back in before the process resolved would have been the kind of move that handed Voss's narrative a point it didn't deserve. She went to the floor she had been reassigned to, the medical surgical ward, and she reported to the floor supervisor, a methodical man named Terry Osman, who looked at her with the wary neutrality of someone who had been briefed on the situation and had not yet decided how to relate to it. "You're on monitoring and documentation this afternoon," he told her. "Okay, standard patient rounds. If you have questions about scope, come to me." "I will." She spent 4 hours doing exactly what she was told. She checked blood pressures and oxygen saturations and documented everything with the same precise attention she brought to everything, and she answered patient questions clearly, and she did not act as though she was anywhere other than where she had been placed. 2 nurses on the floor watched her with an attention that was not unfriendly. The news from the trauma bay the previous night had traveled in the particular rapid, word-of-mouth way that information travels in clinical environments through the break room and the shift change reports, and the small sideways conversations in corridors. By the end of her shift, neither of them had said anything to her directly about it. But one of them, a woman in her 30s named Burgess, who had been a nurse for 8 years and had the tired, particular competence of someone who had seen a lot of people come and go, left a coffee on the nurse's station counter next to where Claire was completing her documentation, and said, without looking up from her own chart, "It was a good thing you did." Last night, Claire looked at the coffee, then at Burgess. "Thank you," she said. Burgess turned a page in her chart. "Just saying." It was a small thing, the smallest possible unit of acknowledgement. But in a day that had been built out of large, complicated, institutional things, it registered with a different weight, the weight of a person who had no stake in the larger situations, simply saying what they thought was true. Claire drank the coffee. Webb called at 6:40 p.m. when she was walking to her car. "Pruitt met with legal this afternoon," he said. "I have a source inside the admin wing. They're trying to determine whether the OIG inquiry, once filed, would create any obligation on the hospital to pause its internal process. Does it? Legal says probably yes, but not definitively. It depends on whether the federal inquiry is framed as covering the hospital's conduct or just Voss's. A pause. Agent is aware. She's framing it to cover both." Claire reached her car and stood beside it in the parking structure. The light in parking structures had always struck her as the most honest light in existence, flat, merciless, no shadows doing anyone any favors. "What about the 3 names?" she said. "The other practitioners." "Contacted 2 of them. One is cooperative. One is working through it. The third is unreachable so far." His voice was careful, which meant what it always meant with Webb, which was that something in the situation was more complicated than the words were conveying. "The one who stopped practicing. That's the unreachable one." Claire said nothing for a moment. "I know," Webb said, reading the silence. "We can't force anyone to participate." "No. But if the pattern holds with 2, it holds with 3. The OIG doesn't need all of them." That's what the agent said. A brief pause. "She also said she may need you present at a preliminary review meeting tomorrow afternoon. VA has been notified that an external inquiry is underway, standard procedure, and there may be an attempt to expedite the internal hearing before the inquiry formally establishes primacy. She's going to try to move it forward. Before noon tomorrow if she can manage it. Pruitt hasn't committed to blocking her." Claire processed that. Who has standing to call the hearing? Voss as the filing party, and Falk as the program director. If both agree on a date and the review board can convene, it happens. A beat. Falk was in his office until 7:30 this evening. I don't know what he decided. She looked at the ceiling of the parking structure. Concrete, gray, a water stain in one panel from a leak that someone had fixed imperfectly. "Webb," she said. "Yeah." "Why did you start pulling threads at 6A? Before I'd even made a decision. The pause was brief but real. Webb was not a man given to unnecessary disclosure, and she had asked a direct enough question that the usual deflection wouldn't cover it. "Because I've been watching people with your profile get managed out of places where they were the best option for 15 years, he said. "And I'm tired of it being the kind of thing that happens without noise." Another pause. "Also because you kept Ramirez alive in the Caradag corridor when I thought we were going to lose him, and I didn't say anything about that afterward because that's not how we operate, and I've been carrying that." A beat. So. She stood in the parking structure with the flat light and the imperfect water stain overhead and felt the particular awkwardness of receiving something honest from someone who was not practiced at delivering it. "Okay," she said. "Okay," he said. She drove home. She was back in the hospital at 7:15 the next morning, which was earlier than her assigned shift start, and exactly the time she would have started under the trauma rotation she had been removed from. She went to the medical surgical floor, reported to Osman, took her assignment, and began rounds with the same careful tension she had brought the day before. At 9:05, her phone buzzed. Holt. She stepped into the corridor to take it. "The OIG inquiry has been filed," Holt said. 40 minutes ago. It's in the system." A pause that carried something in it. Voss called an emergency academic review hearing for 11 a.m. today. Claire looked at the wall in front of her. Can she do that? Falk co-signed the convening notice. Apparently he decided to support her process rather than pause it. Holt's voice was steady, but clipped. "I don't fully understand why. The review board can theoretically proceed despite the federal inquiry, at least until there's a formal directive from the OIG to halt. The agent is working on getting that directive issued, but it requires a senior sign-off that she's waiting on." A pause. "If the hearing happens before the directive arrives, the board could issue a preliminary recommendation within the session. That's not a final action, but it puts your program status in jeopardy in a way that's very difficult to reverse." 11 a.m. was 1 hour and 55 minutes away. "What do I do?" "You attend the hearing," Holt said. "With me. I called the review board coordinator this morning and established representation. They can't legally exclude me from the preliminary session." A pause. "And you bring every piece of documentation you have. Not as argument as record. We don't let them define what happened last night without a competing factual account in that room." "What about the OIG agent?" "She'll be in the building." She can't formally enter the hearing unless the board agrees to admit her, and there's no guarantee they will. But she'll be available. A brief pause. Claire, I want to be clear about something. The hearing is going to be framed as a disciplinary matter. Voss is going to present it as a pattern of conduct, not just last night, but a consistent disregard for clinical authority over 4 months. She's going to have documentation from her own evaluation records. Her evaluations of me. Yes. Claire thought about what 4 months of Sandra Voss's evaluations looked like. Hesitant, inadequate instinct, poor integration with clinical team. All of it written in the careful, neutral language of someone who knew how to make an assessment look objective. She wrote the file she needed, Claire said. It was not quite a question. Here's that way. Holt's voice was precise, which is not unprecedented, and which is exactly the kind of thing that the OIG inquiry will examine. But in the hearing room this morning, it's going to look like a legitimate performance record, unless we put something next to it. Service record. And Rao's statement. I got it in writing this morning. She was emphatic, a pause that had something close to warmth in it. She used the word exemplary. Twice. Claire exhaled. Okay, I'll meet you outside the administrative conference suite at 10:40. Don't be late. She was not late. She was 10 minutes early, standing in the corridor outside the suite where the academic review board was convening, in her scrubs because she had come from rounds and there had been no time to change, which was fine because she was not trying to look like anything other than what she was. Holt was already there, and she was everything her phone manner had suggested: compact, composed, with the quality of someone who had stood in rooms like this before and had not been the one who left defeated. She looked Claire over once, quickly. Good, she said. I look like a nursing student, Claire said. You look exactly like what you are, Holt said. That's the point. The board convened at 11:05. 7 people around a long table, 3 from the nursing program's academic faculty, 2 hospital administrators, 1 external accreditation representative, 1 patient safety officer. Voss was already seated at one side of the table, positioned as the filing party, with a neat stack of documents in front of her. The board chair, a thin woman with reading glasses and the careful authority of someone who chaired committees for a living, opened the session with procedural language that established the purpose of the preliminary hearing and the presence of legal representation for the respondent. Voss did not look at Claire. The chair invited Voss to present her account. And Voss did, in the careful, measured, technically precise language of a senior physician who knew exactly how to construct a narrative that sounded like dispassionate clinical observation, as something considerably more targeted. She described Claire's 4 months in the rotation. She cited her own evaluation records. She described the night of the incident in terms of an unauthorized intervention that had exposed the hospital to liability and the patient to risk. She cited 3 separate sections of the nursing program's scope of practice protocol. She was very good at it. When she finished, the room was quite quiet for a moment, and Claire sat with her hands flat on the table and her face neutral and thought about a lot of things that she did not say. Sensei. Then Holt spoke. She was better. She laid out the service record, the commendations, the combat medic certifications, the operational review from the Karadag corridor. She laid out Rao's written statement. She described with documentary precision the timeline of documentary precision, the inquiry that had been filed that morning, and the pattern of conduct across 3 previous practitioners and 9 years. She did not perform outrage. She did not appeal to sympathy. She put documents in front of people and described what the documents said. The external accreditation representative had gone very still about 4 minutes into Holt's presentation. He picked up the OIG inquiry reference number that Holt placed in front of him and looked at it with the expression of someone who has just seen a category of problem he was not expecting to be handling today. Voss's attorney, a hospital general counsel representative who had the efficient, slightly defensive manner of someone doing damage control for an institution rather than advocacy for an individual, interjected, once to question the relevance of the OIG inquiry to the present proceeding. The board chair looked at him over her glasses. The inquiry speaks to a pattern of conduct that directly contextualizes the respondent's evaluation history. Counselor, I'd like to hear it. Voss picked up her pen, put it down. Her face remained composed, but her hand was not entirely steady. And then the door at the back of the conference room opened. Claire turned, along with most of the room. The OIG agent entered, carrying a single folder and a federal directive form that had a seal on it that the patient safety officer recognized before anyone else did, and that recognition moved across his face in a visible sequence of small adjustments. My apologies for the interruption, the agent said, without sounding apologetic. Place the directive on the table in front of the board. Chair, this is a formal federal hold on any preliminary or final action in this proceeding pending completion of an active Office of Inspector General inquiry. She did not sit down. She stood at the end of the table with the contained stillness of someone who has arrived at the exactly correct moment and knows it. The hold was signed 40 minutes ago. I understand the proceeding has been underway. Per the directive, any actions or recommendations generated in today's session are suspended pending review. The room was very quiet. The board chair picked up the directive and read it. She read it again. She set it down with the care of someone who is not going to say anything that could be interpreted as resistant to a federal document. Voss's attorney leaned toward his papers and shuffled through them with the particular controlled urgency of a person who does not have a response ready and is buying time by simulating one. Voss looked at the directive. She looked at it for a long moment. And then she looked at Claire for the first time since the session had begun, not the sideways, marginalizing look she had deployed consistently across 4 months, but a direct look, the look of one person to another when the positioning has changed, and both of them know it. Claire held her gaze without expression. The hearing is suspended, the board chair said. Her voice was entirely professional and gave nothing away, but there was something in the cadence of it, the measured rhythm of someone choosing their words with considerable care that suggested she was also doing her own internal recalibration. We'll reconvene when the federal review timeline is established. Parties will be notified. She removed her glasses. We're adjourned. Chairs moved. People collected papers. The general counsel representative was already on his phone before he reached the door. The external accreditation representative left the directive on the table and departed without speaking to anyone. Voss remained seated for a moment after the others had moved, papers in front of her, pen in hand, and she had the look of someone who had arrived at a position expecting solid ground and had found something different. Holt leaned toward Claire and said quietly, "Don't say anything to her. Let the process work." Claire had not been planning to say anything. She was watching Voss and thinking not about what came next, the federal review, the investigation, pattern that Webb had documented, and the 2 cooperative former practitioners who had agreed to give statements, but about the one who hadn't been reachable, the one who had stopped practicing altogether. She thought about what it cost to be managed down and out of a thing you were good at by an institution that had decided what you were before it looked at what you could do. She thought about it not abstractly, but in the specific physical way, the accumulation of small redirections and quiet exclusions and evaluation language that made you start to wonder whether the assessment was accurate. The way doubt got installed, the way you started to cooperate with your own diminishment. She had done it for 4 months. One of those names on the whiteboard had done it long enough that they'd stopped practicing. Voss rose and collected her documents with a controlled precision that was the last available version of authority in the room. She walked toward the door. She did not look at Claire again. She was 3 steps from the threshold when her phone rang. She glanced at the screen, and whatever she saw there stopped her in place with a visible, physical arrest of motion, the kind that happens when the information arriving is significant enough to override the body's momentum. She answered. She listened. Her face was already composed, but something underneath it changed, and Claire was close enough to see it, and what she saw was not what she expected to see. It was not fear, though there was an element of that. It was not anger, though there was that too. It was something older and more complicated that Claire did not have a word for. Voss lowered the phone. She turned slowly and looked back at the room, at the agent, at Holt, at the empty chairs, at Claire. She opened her mouth and then said nothing. She walked out. The agent watched her go, then turned to Claire with the measured expression of someone who has just received information in their own earpiece that they are going to share carefully. The third name, the agent said quietly. The one who was unreachable. Claire looked at her. She's not unreachable anymore. She's not unreachable anymore. The agent said it quietly, with the particular economy of someone who understood that those 4 words were going to do more work than a paragraph could. Claire looked at her. What changed? She saw the inquiry filing this morning. It went into a federal database that practitioners with certain clearance levels can access. The agent picked up her folder from the table. She called my office at 10:15. She's been sitting on a written account for 2 years. Didn't file it because she didn't think anyone would look at it the way it needed to be looked at. A pause. Her name is Dr. Ren Castillo. She was a flight surgeon with the Army Reserve before she went into civilian practice. Voss was her department chief during a 2-year fellowship at a hospital in New Mexico. Claire absorbed that. A flight surgeon. Not a nursing student, not a paramedic, a physician. Someone with credentials that were unambiguous by any institutional standard. If Voss had managed a flight surgeon out of a fellowship track, the pattern wasn't scope of practice or training pathway legitimacy. It was about something else. What did Voss do to her? Claire said. That's what we're going to find out. The agent moved toward the door. Castillo is giving a formal statement to my regional office this afternoon via secure video. I'll have a summary by end of day. She stopped at the door and looked back. I go back to your floor, Ms. Donovan. Do your shift. Let the next 24 hours do what they're going to do. Holt gathered her materials and they walked out together. And in the corridor, Holt said, "You understand, this is better than we could have planned for. I understand it's not over. No. But the trajectory has changed." Holt stopped and looked at her directly. "When this resolves, and it will resolve, I want you to be in a position to make choices about what comes next rather than reacting to what's been decided for you. That means staying present and documented and professional through every hour of the process, even when it's tedious, especially when it's tedious." "I know how to wait," Claire said. "I know you do." A pause. "I've read your file. I know exactly how you know how to wait." She said it without sentiment, just as a fact, and it landed the way facts land when they are seen clearly. "Call me if anything moves." She left. Claire stood in the corridor outside the suspended hearing room and listened to the building settle back into its ordinary rhythm's footsteps, a cartwheel, a PA announcement that had nothing to do with anyone in this story, and then she went back to work. Osmond looked at her when she returned to the medical surgical floor, that same wary, neutral look, and she said, "I'm back from an administrative matter. Ready to continue rounds." He nodded. He did not ask. Spent the afternoon doing exactly what the work required. There was a patient in room 14 who was 3 days post-appendectomy and developing the early signs of a wound infection that the morning team had attributed to normal healing variation. Claire documented what she saw with the specific clinical language that made its implications clear without editorializing, flagged it for the attending on call, and was present when the attending confirmed the infection at 4 o'clock and adjusted the treatment plan. It was not dramatic. It was just the job, the same careful looking, the same precise response, the same discipline of doing the right thing in the right order, whether or not anyone was watching. The attending who confirmed the infection was a doctor. Neda Barra, internal medicine, who had the competent and somewhat tired quality of a good physician in the middle of a long shift. He reviewed Claire's documentation, made his own assessment, wrote the orders, and then paused before leaving the room. "Good catch," he said, not making a production of it, just noting it. "Thank you," Claire said. He left. She updated the chart and moved to the next room. Burgess caught her at the nurse's station at 5:30. The same woman as yesterday, same 8-year nurse energy. Same way of saying things sideways while looking at something else. "Heard the hearing got suspended," Burgess said, turning a page in a chart. "It was postponed," Claire said carefully. "Same thing." Burgess turned another page. "People are talking." "I know. Mostly saying things that wouldn't have been said a week ago." She looked up briefly. "That's not nothing." It wasn't. Claire had felt it in the marginal ways that institutional climate shifts not in grand gestures, but in the small recalibrations of who made eye contact and who moved aside and who left a coffee on a counter. The building was watching, the way buildings watch, through its hundreds of individual inhabitants quietly revising their assessments. She did not make too much of it. Institutional warmth was not institutional policy, and the distance between them was where people got hurt. She finished her shift at 6. She drove to Holt's office, which was open late because Holt was the kind of attorney who worked in the mornings people were dealt, rather than the hours she would have preferred, and they spent 40 minutes going through what the hearing suspension meant for the formal complaint timeline and what Claire's documentation needed to look like going forward. Holt got the summary from the OIG agent at 7:15, while Claire was still there. She read it. Her face did not change significantly, but there was a quality to the stillness of it that communicated the same thing as a sharp intake of breath. Phone across the desk. Claire read. Ren Castillo had been 34 when she started her trauma surgery fellowship at Morrow General Hospital in New Mexico 7 years prior. She had come from a distinguished Army Reserve career with a flight surgery specialization and 4 field deployments. She was, by any credentialing standard, an exceptional candidate for advanced surgical training. Sandra Foss had been her department chief. Within the first 3 months, Castillo had been assessed as showing concerning gaps in procedural judgment and difficulty integrating with the civilian clinical culture. She had been removed from the advanced surgical track and placed in a supervisory capacity with limited operative involvement. She had filed an internal grievance. The grievance had been reviewed by a committee that included 2 people who reported directly to Voss. The grievance was dismissed. Castillo had left the fellowship 18 months before its scheduled completion. She had practiced as a hospitalist for 4 years. Afterward was a significant downgrade from the surgical career she had been building, and then 18 months ago, she had stopped practicing entirely. Her written account, compiled over 2 years and never filed, documented 8 specific instances of Voss directly intervening to block her from surgical opportunities, along with a detailed record of evaluation language that systematically translated Castillo's military training and operational decision-making style into civilian clinical deficits. The language was not identical to what Voss had used in Claire's evaluations, but the structure was the same, a consistent transformation of operational competency into clinical inadequacy, using the specific vocabulary of procedural medicine to make a non-traditional practitioner look inadequate to a review board that spoke that vocabulary and no other. At the bottom of the summary, the agent had written a single additional line. Dr. Castillo states she observed Voss access and review her military personnel file during the first week of her fellowship. Voss made no mention of the file to Castillo and did not disclose that she had reviewed it. Claire set the phone on the desk. Holt said she went looking. Before she even met them, Claire said, she pulled the file first, which means the evaluation record wasn't a response to observed deficiencies. Holt's voice was level. It was a predetermined conclusion that she then generated supporting documentation for. She took her phone back. That's not bias in the sense of an unconscious cultural prejudice producing consistent outcomes. That's deliberate. That's a pattern of targeted credential suppression executed with premeditation. The office was quiet for a moment. Outside, Dunmore was doing its evening things traffic, a siren somewhere distant. The ordinary machinery of a city that did not know this conversation was happening in a second-floor office on a side street. Why, Claire said. It was the question she had been carrying since Webb's whiteboard. Why does someone do this consistently over 9 years to practitioners with this specific background? Holt was quiet for a moment, not because she didn't have a thought, but because she was choosing how to frame it. I've seen versions of this before. Not often, but enough. It's usually one of two things. Either genuine pathological contempt, someone who believes, completely sincerely, practitioners from non-traditional backgrounds represent a threat to the institutional authority of formal medical education and acts consistently on that belief. She paused. Or it's protective. Someone who understands that a practitioner with operational experience is capable of seeing things a formally trained clinician would miss, and who finds that threatening to their own position. Those aren't mutually exclusive, Claire said. No, Holt agreed. They're not. The OIG's formal findings came faster than anyone had expected, which was partly the result of Castillo's comprehensive documentation, and partly the result of 3 practitioners' coordinated statements arriving in the same investigative window, and partly Claire suspected, but could not confirm, the result of Webb making additional calls to people in positions that could apply pressure to a timeline. She was notified via Holt on the morning of the 3rd day. She was on the medical surgical floor, midway through morning rounds, when her phone buzzed. She finished the patient interaction she was in the middle of, documented her findings, and then stepped into the corridor and called Holt back. Preliminary OIG findings are in, Holt said without preamble. They've substantiated a pattern of targeted credential suppression across 4 cases, including yours. The language they're using is systematic misrepresentation of practitioner competency to produce predetermined disciplinary outcomes. A pause. They're referring the findings to the Colorado Medical Board, the Nursing Programs Accrediting Board, the Nursing Programs Accrediting Body, and the hospital's governing board simultaneously. Claire held the phone against her ear and said nothing for a moment. The hospital's governing board convened an emergency session this morning, Holt continued. Before I called you. Pruitt is there. 2 outside counsel. The board chair. She paused. Voss has been placed on administrative leave effective this morning, pending the board's review of the OIG findings. Her clinical privileges have been suspended. There it was. Not a dramatic moment. Not a scene with an audience. Just a phone call in a hospital corridor, linoleum underfoot, the sounds of a medication cart going by, and information arriving in the flat, factual language of institutional process. What about the complaint? Claire said. The formal complaint against you has been withdrawn. The nursing program has issued a statement to the Academic Review Board formally rescinding the practicum reassignment and reinstating your trauma rotation placement. A pause. Falk called me this morning. He apologized. He said, and I'm paraphrasing, that he had believed he was giving a legitimate complaint a fair process, and that he had not adequately examined whether the complaint itself was legitimate. It was a partial accounting. She would decide later whether it was sufficient. Okay, Claire said. Claire. Holt's voice shifted slightly. You're clear. As of this morning, you are formally clear. Stood in the corridor and absorbed that. Clear. The institutional word for the removal of something that should never have been placed. She thought about what the last 4 days had cost, not in the heroic sense, not in the narrative sense, but in the real sense of what it actually cost to do what she had done. Statement, the hours, the sustained effort of remaining present and professional in an environment that was actively trying to define her as inadequate. Particular exhaustion of fighting a thing that was designed to make you disappear quietly. She thought about Ren Castillo, who had sat on a written account for 2 years because she didn't think anyone would look at it the way it needed to be looked at. "I need to make a call after this," Claire said. "Of course." A pause. "The hospital's board will want to speak with you later this week. Your participation is voluntary, but would be helpful." "I'll be with you. I'll be there." She hung up. She stood in the corridor for exactly 30 seconds. Then she went back to her patient. The governing board session lasted most of the day. Claire was not in it. The people in it were Pruitt, the board's outside counsel, the OIG agent, Holt representing Claire's interests, representatives from the nursing program's accrediting body, and Sandra Voss, accompanied by her own attorney, a different one than the general counsel representative, who had been at the review hearing, private practitioner who specialized in medical licensing defense, and who had presumably been called in as the situation clarified itself. Because Claire knew the session was happening, because Holt texted her periodic updates in the flat factual shorthand that lawyers use when they are in a room and communicating discreetly. Board reviewing evaluation records, cross-referencing with OIG timeline. Voss's counsel asking for continuance. Denied. Then, 40 minutes later, Castillo's statement admitted as documentary evidence. Voss counsel objecting on relevance grounds. Overruled. Then, second practitioner statement admitted. Then, a gap of 90 minutes, during which Claire was completing afternoon rounds and trying not to read anything into the silence. Then, board in closed session. Could be a while. She finished her shift. She sat in break room. She sat in the break room and ate something she had packed that morning, because the cafeteria felt too exposed, too social, too requiring of a face that could manage other people's curiosity. Burgess came in at one point, looked at her, and said, "You still here?" Shift just ended. "Go home," Burgess said. "It's not going to happen faster because you're in the building." She was right. Claire went home. Holt called at 8:47 p.m. The board's findings are in. Her voice had a quality Claire had not heard in it before, not triumph, which would have been the wrong note, but a kind of measured satisfaction that lived in the same register as justice, when justice actually functions the way it is supposed to. Voss has been formally removed from her department chief position, effective immediately. Her surgical privileges at Harlow Regional are suspended indefinitely pending a Colorado Medical Board review of her professional conduct. The board has issued a formal finding that her evaluation records for 4 practitioners, including you, were materially inaccurate and were generated with the intent to produce disciplinary soapsums not supported by clinical evidence. Claire said nothing. There will be a recommendation to the medical board for formal license review. The board can't revoke the license directly. That's the medical board's authority, but the referral is mandatory given the findings, and it carries significant weight. A pause. There will also be a formal institutional apology to you from the hospital and from the nursing program. That's not standard, and it was not easy to get them to agree to it. Pushed for it. Another pause, because it matters. Not symbolically, because it goes in the record. Claire was sitting in her apartment at the kitchen table, which was where she went when she needed the uncomplicated flatness of a surface that made no demands. She had a glass of water in front of her that she had not touched. "What happens to her now?" Claire said. "The medical board process is its own timeline. It can take months. It can result in sanctions, restrictions, or revocation, depending on what they find when they look at her full professional record." Holt's voice was careful. "I won't tell you it's swift. It isn't, but it's real. What the board found tonight creates a paper trail that does not go away." And the one who stopped practicing, Castillo. A pause. "Her attorney is going to contact me this week about options. There may be grounds for a reinstatement process and potentially a civil action against Morrow General and against Voss individually. A beat. Going to be a longer road. But it's a road that exists now in a way it didn't 4 days ago. Okay. Claire looked at the water glass. Holt, thank you. Don't thank me yet, Holt said. There's still the nursing program's formal reinstatement process, which is administrative and therefore tedious. And there's the hospital's own internal review of how a 4-month pattern of targeted evaluation went undetected by supervisory oversight. She paused. That second one is going to produce some uncomfortable conversations for people who are not Sandra Voss, Falk, and others. A beat. The practicum coordinator who placed you in Voss's rotation. The department administrators who signed off on the evaluation records without reviewing the application notes. Institutional complicity is rarely active. It's mostly people not looking at things they should have looked at. Her voice was not unkind, but it was clear. That's a different kind of accountability than what Voss is facing, but it's not nothing. After she hung up, Claire sat at the kitchen table for a long time. She thought about what 4 months looked like from the inside versus what it looked like in a board finding. From the inside, it had been small exclusions, small redirections, evaluation language that accumulated like water damage, slow and invisible until the structure gave. In a board finding, it was systematic misrepresentation with an intent to produce predetermined outcomes, which was the institutional language for something that had felt, in the living of it, much more like doubt. The particular kind of doubt that gets installed when authority tells you, consistently and in writing, that what you know about yourself is incorrect. She thought about Ben Rauchio because she always eventually thought about Ben Rauchio, and she let herself do that for a while without redirecting it. 19 years old, the Karadag corridor. The decision she had made in under 4 seconds that she had replayed for 3 years looking for the version where it went differently. There wasn't one. She had tried every variable she had access to, and the outcome did not change. He had been too far compromised before she reached him, and the decision she had made had saved the other 5 people in that corridor, and the Army Review Board had said exactly that. And she had not fully believed it until Jonas Pryor's heart monitor stopped alarming and held steady. She thought she was beginning to believe it now, not completely. Not in the clean, resolved way of a story that has been finished and filed. More in the way of a thing that has been looked at directly for the first time in a long time without flinching away, and that has turned out to be survivable. She drank the water. She went to bed. She was at the hospital at 7 the following morning. Not because she had to be the formal reinstatement. Paperwork was still processing, and technically she was in a documentation gap between the rescinded complaint and the official restoration of her trauma placement. The medical surgical floor had patients who needed morning rounds, and Osman was 3 nurses short because of a scheduling conflict. And the fact that her paperwork wasn't finalized did not change the fact that the work was real, and she was capable of it. Osman looked at her when she appeared at the nurse's station. "You're not officially back yet," he said. "I know. You're short today." He looked at her for another moment. Then he handed her a patient roster. Room 12 flagged for reassessment. Overnight note says the numbers shifted. She took the roster. She was in room 12 doing the reassessment when she heard the trauma bay radio go off at the far end of the building, not her section, different wing, but she knew the sound and the particular frequency of a priority call. And for a moment, her body registered it before her mind did, the old instinct orienting towards the sound. She finished the reassessment. She documented. She moved to the next room. At 10:15, Darlene Cho found her in the corridor outside room 9. Darlene had the look of someone who had navigated a complicated week and was not entirely finished with it. She stopped when she saw Claire, and there was a moment where neither of them said anything, which was its own kind of conversation. "I heard the board's decision," Darlene said. "It came through last night. I also heard they found 3 others." Not just you. 4 total. Darlene absorbed that. She had been a nurse for 19 years, which meant she had seen the ways that institutions could be unjust in the small, undramatic, cumulative fashion that rarely made anyone's formal record. Claire could see her processing it with the particular weariness of someone who is not surprised and is also not okay with not being surprised. The phone call I made, Darlene said, the morning after, to the Academic Standards Board. She paused. I wasn't sure it would matter. It was one more thing in the right direction, Claire said. Those add up. Darlene nodded slowly. Then she said, Rao's looking for you. When you have a moment. She's in surgical prep. Claire finished her corridor and found Rao in the surgical prep area at 11, between cases, still in her OR cap, and with the particular focused energy of a surgeon in the middle of a working day, who is pausing not because the schedule allows it, but because she has decided the pause matters. Rao looked at her the way she had looked at her in the trauma bay 4 nights ago, with the direct, clinical attention of someone who is assessing what they are actually looking at rather than what they have been told to expect. You're reinstated, Rao said, officially, tomorrow. Paperwork. I know about the paperwork. She paused. Put in a formal request to the trauma program director this morning. I want you back on trauma rotation as a standing placement, not a visiting student. She said it without dramatic emphasis, as though it were a logistical matter rather than a significant reframing of Claire's entire position in the hospital. Program director is Hartley. He's reviewing it. Given the board's findings, I expect him to approve. Another pause. I should have done it after the first night. I didn't, because I was trying to stay out of a process I wasn't officially part of, and that was the wrong call. Claire looked at her. You gave this statement. I gave a written statement. That's not the same as standing in the room and saying this person belongs here. Rao's voice was not quite apologetic. She was not the apologizing type, but it had an honesty in it that Claire recognized as its own kind of accountability. I'm saying it now. It was imperfect. It was also real. Thank you, Claire said. Rao nodded once. She was already moving back toward the OR. At the door, she paused without turning around. Hartley's going to want to meet with you about the protocol changes. Claire stopped. What protocol changes? The techniques you used the other night. The hemorrhage control sequence. She glanced back briefly. He wants them in the trauma training curriculum. Not as a case study. As a standing procedure. A beat. I told him you'd need to be involved in writing them up. You were the one who executed them. She went back into surgical prep, and the door swung closed behind her. Claire stood in the corridor with the ordinary sounds of the building around her and thought about her techniques going into a training curriculum, going into the hands of physicians and nurses who would use them on people who needed them, in moments that couldn't wait for the right person to happen to be in the room. It was not a dramatic thought. It was a practical one. The kind that happens when something that lived only inside one person starts to belong to the work itself. She went back to her floor. Webb came to find her at 2 p. He was in civilian clothes again. He was always in civilian clothes in the hospital, though the building required a version of him, as though the building required a version of him that existed outside institutional identity, and he had 2 coffees, which meant this was a conversation. They sat in the family consultation room, off the main corridor, which was currently unoccupied, and he handed her one of the coffees, and she drank it because she had been going since 7 and needed it. Pryor's being discharged tomorrow, Webb said. He wanted me to tell you. He's ahead of schedule. He does that. A brief pause. He also wanted me to tell you that his unit has a standing relationship with Harlow Regional's flight program for medevac coordination, and that relationship now comes with a specific request that you be involved in any personnel triage that goes through this facility. Claire looked at him. That's not a thing he can request. It's not an official request. Webb turned his coffee cup. It's the kind of thing that gets said once to the right people and then becomes how things work. He paused. The way things have always actually worked, in my experience. She absorbed that. What about Castillo? He looked at his coffee. Called me yesterday. I don't know how she got my number. A pause that was almost dry. Talking to Holt about the reinstatement process, she said. He stopped. Started again. She said she'd been in the account for 2 years and hadn't filed it because she thought if no one else had said anything, maybe the problem was her. Maybe her assessment of what happened was wrong. He was quiet for a moment. She said, seeing the inquiry filing, changed that. Seeing her own experience in a federal document described with the same pattern language as 3 other cases. He paused. She said it was the first time in 4 years she felt like someone had looked at it the right way. Claire said nothing. She's going to try to come back, Webb said. Practice. She should. Yeah. He looked at her directly. So should you. For the record, not as a concession, not as a compromise, as the thing you are in the place where it's actually needed. The consultation room was quiet. Somewhere outside, a helicopter passed, not the hospitals. Just a news or commercial flight crossing the sky over Dunmore. Claire heard it, and for the first time in a long time, and did not feel the reflexive tightening that the sound had produced in her for the last 18 months. She noticed that, filed it. I'm going to be here, she said. I know. Webb stood. He picked up his coffee. He did the thing he always did, which was not make a moment of the things that were moments, just acknowledge them with the small, precise efficiency of a person who understood what mattered and did not require ceremony for it. He was at the door when she said, the Karadag corridor. He stopped, turned. You said you'd been carrying it, she said. What I did that night, that you hadn't said anything after. She paused. I needed to hear it at the time. I didn't get it, and I spent a long time thinking it meant I'd read the situation wrong. She looked at him steadily. I understand why it doesn't work that way operationally. I'm not saying you were wrong not to say it. I'm saying it cost me something. It was the most direct she had been about any of it. Not an accusation. She knew the structure. She knew the constraints. She had operated inside the same culture long enough to understand why certain things didn't get said. But it was the truth, and the truth had earned its place in the room. Webb held her gaze. His face was the same controlled, quiet face it always was, but there was something in the quality of the pause before he answered that was different from his usual operational efficiency. Something that was taken a moment to actually arrive before it spoke. You didn't read it wrong, he said. And it cost me something, too. Saying it. A pause. I'm sorry for that. She nodded. He left. She sat in the consultation room for another 2 minutes, because the day had been long, and she was tired in the way of someone who has done the work that needed doing, rather than the work that was comfortable, and because 2 minutes of stillness was what she had, and she was not going to waste it. Then her pager went off. Not the general hospital page. Her personal clinical pager, the one linked to the Trauma Bay alert system that she should not have been linked to yet, because her reinstatement paperwork was not officially processed, which had apparently been reconnected by someone in the network administration who had not waited for the paperwork. She looked at the alert code. Priority call, Trauma Bay. Multiple inbound. She stood. She was already walking when she realized that Webb had called her pager number from somewhere in the building, because no one else had it, and that he had done it because there were patients coming, and she was the right person in the right place, and the paperwork could catch up with the reality. She pushed through the door and turned down the corridor toward the trauma wing at a pace that was not running, but was everything adjacent to it. And she was 40 feet from the trauma bay when Darlene Cho appeared in the hallway, moving the other direction, and stopped to saw. Claire. Darlene took in the pager in Claire's hand, the direction she was moving. The look on her face. She stepped aside without being asked and said, Bay 2. Claire went in, and then she stopped. Because standing in Bay 2, in a hospital gown, and a look of someone who has been awake for 36 hours, making decisions that no one had prepared her to make, was a woman she did not recognize, but beside her, on the gurney, was a man in a hospital bracelet from a different facility, with a chart that had been transferred and a presentation that Claire could read in 4 seconds from the doorway. And what the chart said and what she was seeing with her own eyes did not match. The attending on duty, Dr. Harlan Beck, was reviewing the transferred chart and moving toward the patient with the confident efficiency of someone who has read the documentation and believes what it says. Tension pneumothorax, Beck said to the room, reading from the transfer notes. They decompressed in transit. He's stable? We're monitoring for. He's not stable, Claire said. Beck looked up. His expression moved through surprise, assessment, and something close to irritation in rapid sequence. Excuse me. The decompression solved the pneumothorax. Not what's happening now. She was already moving closer, her eyes on the patient's chest, the color of his face, the quality of his breathing, the rhythm she could see rather than hear. He's in obstructive shock. Look at his neck veins. Look at the trachea. Beck looked. 2 seconds of silence. Needle and a chest tray, Claire said. Right side. Now. Beck's mouth opened, closed. Darlene Cho was already moving to the supply cabinet. And in the doorway of Bay 2, Dr. Anita Rao, who had been walking past on her way to a different wing, and had paused when she heard Claire's voice, watching with her arms crossed, and the expression of someone who had been exactly right about something and was not going to make a point of it. Beck looked at Claire. He looked at the patient. He looked at the neck veins, which were doing what Claire had said they were doing. Talk me through it, he said, and she did. Because this was the work. Not the board findings, not the reinstatement paperwork, not the formal apology that was coming, and the protocol documentation, and the curriculum rewrite, and all the institutional machinery now turning in the right direction. All of that was real, and all of it mattered. But this, the patient on the gurney, the specific decision in the specific moment, the voice that cut through when it had to this, was what all of it was for. Midclavicular line, second intercostal, Claire said. Angle 15 degrees. He doesn't have long. Beck's hands were already moving. Such like sexologically, professionally. Somewhere in the building, the paperwork processing her reinstatement was still sitting in an administrative queue. Somewhere down the hall, a governing board's findings were being entered into a permanent institutional record. And in Bay 2, a man who had come in with a chart that told the wrong story was breathing more easily with every second because someone in that room had read what the chart missed and said so out loud. The monitors changed tone. Beck let out a breath that was quieter than relief, but held the same weight. And then he looked at Claire not with the surprise of someone encountering the unexpected, but with the particular, direct attention of a physician who has just recalibrated and said, "Where did you train?" It was the first time anyone in that hospital had asked her that question and meant it as the beginning of a sentence rather than the end of one. She looked at him. She thought about how she had spent 4 months answering that question by not answering it, by standing back, by letting the room decide what she was before she showed them. She thought about everything that had happened since a helicopter landed on the roof of this building 4 nights ago. Everywhere that mattered, she said. And before Beck could respond, her pager went off again. Second call, Bay 1. She was already moving. Bay 1 had a teenage boy with a crush injury from a construction site collapse, and he was scared in the specific way that teenagers are scared when they are in pain and alone, which is loudly, and without the practiced stoicism that adults develop after years of learning to perform composure for each other's benefit. Claire went in and did the job. She did not think about board findings or paperwork or the particular look on Beck's face when she had told him where to put the needle. She thought about the boy's blood pressure, which was holding, but had dropped 6 points in the last 4 minutes, according to the incoming paramedic's handoff, and about the crush pattern on his left forearm, which was consistent with a beam impact and not consistent with the compartment syndrome the transfer sheet was flagging, and about the way he was breathing in short controlled bursts that suggested he was managing pain actively rather than being overridden by it, which meant his cognition was intact and he was frightened rather than dissociating. Told him her name. She told him what she was doing before she did each thing. She kept her voice at exactly the register that said, "I have done this before, and you are going to be okay without making it a promise." She couldn't guarantee, because she had learned the hard way, that the people in the most distressed could hear the difference between honest reassurance and performed certainty, and that the former actually helped and the latter did not. His name was Owen, 16. He had been on a school construction volunteer project that should have had more adult supervision than it did, and that was a separate problem for a separate set of people to address. The attending who came in behind her was Harlan Beck, who had followed from Bay 2 at a half jog and arrived already having revised his understanding of the evening. He reviewed Owen's presentation, alongside Claire's running assessment, asked 2 clarifying questions, agreed on the treatment plan, and did not once tell her to step back. It was the smallest possible unit of institutional change. 1 attending, 1 patient, 1 interaction, where the question, "What does she know?" superseded the question, "What is she authorized to know?" But it was real, and real things accumulate. Owen was transferred to orthopedic surgery for the forearm evaluation at 4:17 p.m. He was not in danger. On his way out, he looked at Claire from the gurney and said, with the forthright candor of a 16-year-old who had not yet learned to be indirect about gratitude, "You made it less scary." "Thanks." She almost said, "That's my job," which was the deflective response, the one that kept the moment from requiring anything from her emotionally. She stopped herself. "You did well," she said instead. "You stayed calm when it was hard. That actually helps." He nodded, satisfied, and the gurney rolled away. She stood in the empty bay for a moment and let that settle, the way small, true things settle when you let them, and then she turned around and walked out. Her reinstatement paperwork cleared at 5:48 p.m. that same day, which was faster than the administrative timeline should have allowed, and which Holt later told her was the result of the nursing program director personally expediting it rather than letting it sit in the standard queue, which was Falk's version of accountability. It was imperfect accountability, a bureaucratic gesture rather than a reckoning, but it was what institutional acknowledgement looked like in practice, and she had long since stopped expecting the institutions to feel things the way the people inside them did. She received the confirmation on her phone in the break room, read it once, and put her phone in her pocket. Burgess was making coffee at the counter. She looked over her shoulder at Claire's expression. "Good news?" she said. Paperwork cleared. Burgess turned back to the coffee maker. "About time," she said, which was all she said, which was enough. The formal institutional apology arrived the following week in the shape of a letter on governing board letterhead that Holt had negotiated and reviewed before it was issued, and which contained language that was careful and precise and did not try to minimize what had been done, while also being careful not to trigger additional liability exposure, which was the particular tightrope walk of institutional acknowledgement in the current era. It described the 4-month period of Claire's practicum in terms of a pattern of evaluation practices that failed to accurately reflect the respondent's documented competency and created a disciplinary trajectory unsupported by clinical evidence. Formally rescinded all evaluation records generated by Dr. Sandrovas pertaining to Claire Donovan, and directed that they be removed from her student file and replaced with an assessment notation indicating that the prior evaluations had been found invalid by governing board review. It was not a warm letter. Institutions do not write warm letters. But it said what it needed to say in language that would follow the record in the right direction. And that was the functional purpose of it. Claire read it at the kitchen table in the morning before her shift. She read it twice. She thought about what it meant to have something removed from a record that had never been true to begin with, and whether the removal was satisfying or simply correct, and concluded that it was correct, which was a different and more durable thing than satisfying. She folded it, put it in the drawer where she kept the things that mattered, and went to work. Colorado Medical Board convened its formal review of Sandra Voss's professional conduct 6 weeks after the OIG referred its findings. This was fast by medical board standards, which moved at the pace of an institution that was processing dozens of cases simultaneously and had no obligation to any individual timeline. This was partly the result of the OIG referral, carrying explicit urgency language, and partly the result of 3 formal complaints that had been filed by the time the board convened. Claire's attorney had filed on her behalf. Ren Castillo had filed with her own attorney, and the second cooperative practitioner, a former Army paramedic named Theodore Wark, who had been managed out of a fellowship track at a different institution, had filed with representation that Webb had quietly helped him find. The third name, the one who had been between unreachable and cooperating, remained on the periphery. Claire did not know her story. She knew only that she existed, that she had stopped practicing, and that somewhere in the machinery, now turning in the right direction, her experience was part of the documented pattern, even if her voice was not yet in the room. That was imperfect. She held it as such. The medical board review was not public in the way a court proceeding is public, but its outcomes were medical board disciplinary actions, were a matter of public record in Colorado, available to anyone who searched the practitioner registry. Claire did not attend. She was not invited and had no standing to be present, and Holt had told her clearly that her role in the medical board process was as a documented complainant, not a participant, and that the best thing she could do for the outcome was stay out of the way and let the record speak. She stayed out of the way. She worked. She was on the trauma rotation by then, formally, permanently, with a standing placement that Rao had secured and Hartley had approved, and which nobody at the hospital was now in a position to comfortably dispute. She worked alongside Beck and a rotating cast of residents and attending physicians. And she was not always right, not always the fastest, and not always the person in the room with the most formal knowledge of a given pharmacological interaction or a specific surgical subspecialty. She was a nursing student who was 8 months from completing her degree, and she occupied that role with the specificity it required. But she was also the person who had kept Jonas Pryor alive with her hands and a clamp in the 40 seconds that decided whether he had a future, and the person who had read an obstructed patient's presentation correctly when the chart said otherwise, and the person whose voice had made a 16-year-old boy less afraid in a moment when fear was the thing most likely to make everything worse. And those things existed alongside each other in the same person. And the hospital was slowly learning how to hold both of them at once without needing to collapse one into the other. It was not seamless. Real institutions rarely manage seamlessness. Beck still second-guessed her sometimes, reflexively, before he caught himself and reconsidered. There was a resident named Torres who had absorbed enough of the old institutional culture to carry some of its frictions, and who occasionally bridled at a student with opinions and with whom Claire had 3 conversations over 6 weeks that were variously uncomfortable and productive, and unresolved. Darlene Cho trusted her completely and showed it by treating her exactly the same as she treated everyone else, which was the highest form of professional respect Claire had yet encountered in a civilian hospital. These were not the conditions of vindication, as it appears in simple stories. They were the conditions of a real institution in the actual process of changing, which is slower and more uneven and less satisfying than the version that exists in narrative, and which requires you to keep showing up for it, even on the days when showing up feels like repetition rather than progress. She showed up. Jonas Pryor came back to the hospital 3 weeks after his discharge, which was not a medical visit. He walked through the main entrance on a Tuesday afternoon without a wheelchair or a cane, which was a ahead of schedule enough that the rehab team had apparently had opinions about it, and he went to the nurse's station on the trauma floor and asked for Claire Donovan. She was in the middle of a documentation session at the counter, and she looked up when Darlene said her name, and there he was, slightly less pale than he'd been in recovery, moving with the careful deliberateness of someone whose leg was functional but not yet forgotten, wearing civilian clothes that made him look like an ordinary person rather than a patient or an operator. He had a small paper bag from a bakery 2 blocks from the hospital that he set on the counter in front of her. "I didn't know what you liked," he said, "so I got 4 things." She looked at the bag. "You didn't have to come back here." "I know." He paused. "I wanted to." He looked at her with the same direct, frank attention he'd had in the recovery room. "I also wanted to tell you that the unit has submitted a formal commendation to the hospital's governing board, recognizing your role in my care. Went in last week. Webb coordinated it." He paused. "It's not operational, so it's not the kind of thing that goes in a service record. But it goes in the hospital's permanent commendation file, which is public, which means it's the kind of thing that answers a certain kind of question before anyone has to ask it." Claire absorbed that. Webb didn't mention it. Webb doesn't mention things. He just does them. Something in Pryor's expression was almost amused, in the way of someone who has known Marcus Webb long enough to have made peace with his particular operating style. "He also told me to tell you that the 3rd practitioner, the one who stopped practicing, agreed to give a statement to the medical board. Last week, her attorney contacted the board directly." She went still. "I don't know the details," Pryor said. "Just that she did it." He paused. "Webb thought you'd want to know." She did want to know. She had been carrying that particular not knowing for 6 weeks. The way you carry a thing when you understand it's not yours to resolve, but it matters to you anyway. "Okay," she said. Her voice was steadier than she felt, which was not an unusual condition for her. Pryor nodded. He picked the bag back up and held it out again. "Eat something. You look like you've been here since 6. She had been there since 6:30. She took the bag. He left the way he had come in, straightforward, unhurried, without ceremony, and she watched him go through the corridor doors and thought about the specific chain of events that had connected them. A helicopter at 11:44 p.m., a blood pressure monitor alarming, a woman stepping forward because the alternative was watching someone die, and everything that had followed from that one decision forward, through 6 weeks of institutional machinery and human complexity and small, imperfect acts of accountability. She thought, "It is strange how much depends on a single moment, and how little the moment itself knows about its own significance while it is happening." She opened the bag. There was a croissant, a lemon bar, what appeared to be a small cranberry scone, and a brownie wrapped in parchment. She ate the lemon bar standing at the counter and left the rest for the floor and went back to work. The Colorado Medical Board issued its findings 8 weeks after the review convened. Public record entry appeared in the practitioner registry on a Thursday morning, and Holt sent Claire the link at 7:42 a.m. with a message that said, "It's done. Call me when you're ready." Claire read it on her phone in the parking structure before she went in. Sandra Voss's medical license had been formally sanctioned. The board's findings cited a documented pattern of professional conduct involving the deliberate presentation of practitioner competency assessments across multiple clinical settings over a period of 9 years. The sanctions included a 5-year probationary restriction on any department leadership or supervisory authority over other practitioners, mandatory professional conduct remediation, and a formal notation in the permanent practitioner registry that would be visible to any institution conducting a credentialing review. It was not revocation. Holt had warned her it might not be, because revocation required a finding of direct patient harm, and the board's evidence was about practitioners rather than patients, and boards were conservative institutions that moved in defined channels. But it was real. It was public. It was the kind of record that follows a person through every subsequent application, every subsequent credentialing process, every institution that asks the standard question and pulls the standard registry. The language was plain and specific, which meant that anyone who looked would understand exactly what had been found without needing to read between the lines or request supplementary documentation. Claire sat in her car in the parking structure and read it twice. She did not feel triumphant. She had not expected to. Triumph was the emotion of someone who has won something, and what had happened was not a victory in any clean sense. It was a correction, partial and imperfect, and arrived at through a process that had cost real things from real people. And corrections do not feel the same as wins, even when they are the right outcome. What she felt was something quieter and more durable. The particular quality of a thing being true and documented and visible, after a period in which it had been true and undocumented and invisible. The difference between those two states was the difference between carrying something alone and having it exist in the world in a form that did not require your constant effort to maintain. She thought about Ren Castillo, whose statement to the medical board had been the thing that completed the pattern. She had not spoken to Castillo directly. They existed on parallel tracks of the same institutional process, and Holt had said it was cleaner to keep them separate until the formal proceedings were resolved. But she knew, from what the agent had told her, that Castillo's account had been the most comprehensive and the most damning because Castillo was a physician, and her evaluation and her record had been as systematically distorted as Claire's and the others. And there was something about a flight surgeon's credentials being systematically rewritten as inadequate that even the most conservative board member found difficult to attribute to legitimate clinical disagreement. She thought about what Castillo had said, that she had been sitting on the account for 2 years because she thought if no one else had said anything, maybe the problem was her. She had thought the same thing. Not in those exact words. Not consciously, but the logic had lived inside the 4 months she had spent standing at the edge of trauma bays with a clipboard, absorbing evaluation language that said she was hesitant, inadequate, without instinct. The logic was, the institution is telling you who you are, and the institution has authority, and authority has the infrastructure of consensus behind it. And consensus is harder to argue with than a single person's opinion because it looks like evidence rather than judgment. The way you argue with it, it turned out, was not by becoming louder or by accumulating counter-evidence alone, though the counter-evidence mattered. It was by finding the other people the institution had done the same thing to, and putting all of it in a room at the same time, and letting the accumulated weight of it speak in the flat, factual language that institutions could not dismiss. It required other people to be willing to speak. That was the part that was not guaranteed, and the part that she had not controlled, and the part that had happened anyway. Web pulling threads, prior asking questions, Castillo deciding that federal filing changed the calculus, work providing documentation, the unnamed third practitioner finally giving a statement that she had spent 4 years deciding whether to give. None of those people owed her anything. None of them had acted for her specifically. They had acted because the situation was wrong, and the opportunity to say so had arrived, and they had taken it. She sat with that for a moment. Then she called Holt. "I read it," she said. "How are you?" It was not a question Holt asked casually. She asked it with the direct specificity of someone who wanted an actual answer. "I'm okay," Claire said. "I'm genuinely okay. Not in the way of having resolved everything, some of it I'm not going to resolve. That's just true. But I'm okay in the way of being clear about what this is and what it means and what comes next." She paused. "That feels different than I expected it to. How did you expect it to feel?" "Bigger," Claire said honestly. "Or smaller. I'm not sure which." Holt was quiet for a moment. In my experience, the outcomes that matter most feel like exactly what you're describing. Not an explosion. Just true. Settled. A pause. The ones that feel big are usually the ones that are about something other than justice. Claire thought about that. What are they about? Winning. Holt's voice was dry in the way of someone who had seen both kinds and knew the difference. Justice is quieter. She called Ren Castillo that afternoon. She had gotten the number from Holt, who had gotten it from Castillo's attorney, who had asked Castillo and been told yes. She was not sure what she was going to say, and she did not script it, because scripting it would have made it into something it wasn't. Castillo answered on the third ring. Her voice was different than Claire had built. In her imagination, from the second-hand accounts, lower, more direct, with the quality of someone who had been thinking clearly for a long time, but had not had many occasions to demonstrate it. Ms. Donovan, she said. Claire said. Please. A brief pause. Ren. There was a moment of silence that was not uncomfortable. The silence of two people who know a significant amount about each other's experience without having shared any of it directly, finding the register of the conversation. I wanted to say thank you, Claire said, for the statement. I know it wasn't easy, Castillo said. I'm not going to pretend it was, but it was the right thing, and I knew it was the right thing for 4 years, and I didn't do it for 4 years. So, a pause. The thank you goes the other direction, actually. You forced the situation into a place where not doing it became harder than doing it. Her voice was not warm exactly, but it was honest in the way that Claire understood not performing anything, just stating what was true. It's not a small thing. Are you going to come back? Claire said. To practice. A longer pause. I don't know yet. Holt is helping me look at the reinstatement process. There are options. A beat. I've been a hospitalist for 4 years, and I've been good at it, and I've also spent 4 years knowing I was capable of more and choosing not to try. Because the last time I tried, something specifically designed to stop me was waiting. She paused. I need to decide whether that thing being gone changes what I want to do, or whether I've changed. Another pause. That's going to take a while. That's okay, Claire said. Is it? Yes, she meant it. Taking a while to figure out what you actually want after a long time of having someone else define it, that's not a failure. That's just the work. Castillo was quiet for a moment. You sound like you've done it. I'm doing it, Claire said. I'm not done. It was the most honest thing she had said about herself in a long time, and it felt like exactly the right thing to say to exactly the right person. Not a resolution or recognition, the particular kind that happens between people who have been through versions of the same thing and don't need to explain the inside of it to each other. They talked for 23 minutes. Not about the case, mostly. Medicine, about the specific texture of trauma work versus surgical work versus the thing that flight surgery required. It was a kind of decision-making that operated at a speed and altitude that civilian practice rarely demanded. About what it was like to carry operational training into a civilian institution that had no framework for it. About the small ways that experience showed up in how you looked at a patient before you looked at the chart. When they hung up, Claire sat with the phone in her hand for a moment and thought that one of the lasting costs of what Voss had done was not the individual careers she had interrupted, but the knowledge that had been taken out of circulation the things Castillo would have done in a surgical theater that she hadn't done, the cases that Wark would have handled differently, the specific quality of attention that people with that training brought to clinical environments sent for years from places where it could have mattered. That was the thing that didn't get restored by a medical board finding. The finding stopped the pattern going forward. It did not recover what had already been lost. She held that truth without flinching from it. Some things were not recoverable. The honest response to that was not to minimize it, but to do the work that remained. Her graduation from the nursing program was a Thursday afternoon in May in an auditorium that seated 400 and held about 300 because the programs had staggered their ceremonies, and her cohort was relatively small. She wore the standard cap and gown. She sat in alphabetical order. When they called her name, she walked across the stage and accepted her degree from Falk, who shook her hand with both of his and held it a beat longer than the standard handshake and said, "I'm sorry it took as long as it did." "Congratulations, Miss Donovan," and she said thank you and moved on, because there was a line behind her, and the auditorium was warm, and Falk's accounting, while imperfect, was sincere, and she had made her peace with what imperfect sincerity was worth. Webb was in the audience, with Pryor, who was walking without difficulty now, and two other members of their unit whose names she had never been told and who sat in the auditorium seats with the settled, watchful patience of people who were accustomed to waiting for things to happen and were fine with it. She saw them when she returned to her seat, because she knew where to look. Darlene Cho was there. Rao was there. In the back, having come from a surgical suite and still wearing her oar cap on top of her dress clothes, which was the most purely Rao thing that Claire could have imagined. Beck was there, which surprised her. Burgess was there, which did not. After the ceremony, there was a reception in the lobby with the institutional catering that all institutional receptions have, and Claire moved through it, doing the thing she had always done in social situations, moving efficiently, being genuinely present when people spoke to her, not performing warmth she didn't feel, but not withholding it when she did. Webb found her by the windows overlooking the parking lot, which was where she had gravitated, when the room got loud. "Hawk," he said. "I have a degree now," she said. "I'm a nurse." "I know." His voice was the same as always, contained, direct, with the particular quality of warmth that he expressed by showing up, rather than by saying the warm thing. "How does that feel?" She considered it. "Like something I actually did," she said. "Not like something that happened to me." He nodded slowly. That was the right answer, and they both knew it. Pryor appeared with 2 drinks that were not alcohol because the nursing program's reception was a dry event, which he noted with a dry expression of his own. He gave one to Claire and stood beside Webb, and the three of them looked out at the parking lot for a moment, in the particular comfortable silence of people who have been through something together and do not need to narrate it. "Rao's proposing a joint trauma certification program," Pryor said eventually, "between the hospital and the DoD Medical Liaison Office, for practitioners transitioning out of military medicine into civilian practice." He paused. "Webb's unit is involved in the planning." Claire looked at Webb. "It's early," Webb said. "Nothing formal. But the need is documented, and the OIG inquiry created a policy window that the liaison office is trying to use before it closes." "What would it do?" Claire said. "Create a credentialing framework that translates operational medical training into civilian practice terms, so that the next person who walks into a practicum rotation with a combat medic background and 3 years of special operations support has a recognized credential structure instead of an application. Note that says noted but not relevant." He paused. "And so that the institution receiving them has an obligation to review that framework before making placement decisions." It was institutional machinery aimed at a structural problem, which was slower and less satisfying than individual accountability, but was the thing that lasted. Individual accountabilities stopped one Sandra Voss. Structural change was the thing that made it harder for the next one to operate, for 9 years before anyone pulled a thread. "Who else is involved in the planning?" she said. Webb looked at her with the expression that was not quite a smile, but lived adjacent to it. "We were hoping you'd be one of them." She looked out the window at the parking lot, which was filling with families taking photographs and people in cap and gown doing the things you do after a milestone, all the ordinary performance of achievement and arrival. She had not expected to feel much about today. She had been practical about it, treating it as a procedural milestone rather than an emotional event. She had been wrong about that. She felt things, not the uncomplicated things of a story with clean resolution, not the welling, Hollywood swell of a life corrected and a future bright and simple as head. More the complicated, human things, gratitude that was edged with grief for the time it had taken, satisfaction that was edged with awareness of everything that remained unresolved, pride that was edged with memory, always memory. Ben Rauchio at 19, the 6 who came home, the one who hadn't, and the long accounting she had done for that, and the ongoing work of living with the result of the accounting. She thought about what Holt had said. Justice is quieter. She thought about the boy named Owen, who had said you made it less scary, and the way that one sentence had done something that 4 months of standing in trauma bays watching had not. She thought about what it meant to have spent 4 months being told, in the careful and institutional language of evaluated performance, that she was hesitant, inadequate, without instinct, and to have known, quietly and without anyone to confirm it, that what she was being told was wrong, and to have carried that knowing without being able to make it visible, and to have had it become visible, finally, not through argument, but through circumstance. The circumstance of a helicopter at 11:44 p.m., and a man who recognized her voice and said one word. It was not a plan. It was not the story she would have written for herself. Was messier and more expensive and more dependent on other people than any narrative she could have controlled, and it had required her to do the one thing she had been most determined not to do, which was let people see who she was. She had spent 18 months trying to bury the person who had earned a call sign in a special operations unit, trying to be only the nursing student, the observer, the quiet presence in the corner who did not complicate the room. She had done it because she believed that the version of herself who had trained in the field and kept people alive in the dark was incompatible with the version of herself who wanted to heal in peacetime, who wanted to work in a building with corridors and monitors and the sounds of ordinary institutional life rather than the sounds of operational darkness. She understood now that she had been wrong about the incompatibility. Not wrong that the transition was real, it was. The person who stood in a trauma bay at Harlow Regional was not identical to the person who had worked the Karadag corridor and should not be and was not trying to be. Growth and change were not betrayal. Choosing a different context for the same essential capability was not erasure. But the capability itself, the looking, the reading of situations before they declared themselves, the voice that cut through when everything else was noise, that did not have a civilian version and a military version. It was just the thing she was, the thing she had always been before she had been trained into it, and that the training had sharpened into something specific and deployable and real. She had tried to put it away. It had not stayed put. Some things don't. Yes, she said, to Webb, to the planning question, to the framework and the policy window, and the work that was not finished and would not be finished for a long time. I'll be involved. Webb nodded. That was all. She was on shift the following Monday at 7 a.m. The trauma bay was at its usual early morning state, cleaned, restocked, the particular institutional readiness of a space that has processed the previous night and reset for whatever the next hours would bring. She ran through the equipment check with the methodical attention she brought to everything, verifying each item against the protocol list, making notes on 2 things that needed restocking. Beck came in at 7:15. He nodded at her. She nodded back. Darlene arrived at 7:20 and began the shift handoff with the night charge nurse in the efficient, dense shorthand of a handoff that had 19 years of practice behind it. 7:30, the radio crackled. Incoming. Single patient. MVC 8 at 8 minutes. Claire clipped her radio to her pocket, pulled on her gloves, and moved to the assigned position in the bay, not the corner, not the periphery. The position where the work would require her. She was not thinking about board findings or OIG inquiries or the protocol documentation currently being reviewed by the trauma program director or the planning meetings for the certification framework that would start in 3 weeks. She was thinking about the incoming patient, who existed as nothing but a call code and an ETA and a set of circumstances she did not yet know, and who would arrive in 8 minutes and need someone to see them clearly, was the job. Not the vindication or the recognition or the formal institutional correction of what had been wrong. Those things were real, and they mattered, and she was not diminishing them. But they were the conditions under which the job happened, not the job itself. The job was the patient, the specific person, the 8 minutes. The bay doors were ready. The equipment was checked. Team was in position. 8 minutes became 7, became 6. She stood in the place where the work would find her, and she waited, calm and specific, with the particular quality of readiness that does not present itself, that does not need to, because it has been tested enough times in enough genuine darkness, that it no longer requires an audience to be real. She had stopped being invisible, not because she had demanded to be seen, not because she had argued her way into a room, not because she had performed competency for people who needed convincing, but because she had stopped cooperating with the version of herself that other people's doubt had tried to install and had remained quietly, stubbornly, at considerable cost, the person she had always actually been. The monitors hummed. The team breathed. The bay held its readiness. The radio crackled again, 1 minute out. Claire Donovan, nursing graduate, former combat medic. Hawk pulled a breath in and let it out slow, and when the doors opened, she was ready. She had always been ready. That was the thing they had spent 9 years trying to make her forget. She hadn't.